So last episode, we talked about this concept of the friend-enemy distinction, which comes from a book called The Concept of the Political, which is written by something of a controversial figure, but has actually gained in prominence as of late. In fact, even though this person is considered to be on the extreme right, he was actually kind of revived by a lot of leftist thinkers, especially within Red China. But we're also starting to see him mentioned more on the right as well. And the whole idea of the friend-enemy distinction is kind of what we see playing out within U.S. politics today. And that's why it's so important to actually understand what he was talking about, why it's important. And last episode was all about doing that. It was all about going through kind of an internal analysis and critique of that theory. Where did we agree with it? Where did we disagree with it? But we kind of left on that cliffhanger of, so what do we do about it? Now that we've got a better idea of what's going on, what do we do about it? So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a very quick recap, although we would encourage you to go back and watch that full hour and a half long episode. But we're going to do a quick recap of it. And then today we're going to get into what do we do about it. And we don't just mean the collective, like what do we as a people do about it? Because quite frankly, that's frustrating. It is really frustrating when we're constantly told, what you need to do is vote harder and love the Constitution more. No. What are practical things that we can do about it? Not just as members of a country, a community, but members of a family, as individuals. What are practical ways that we can go about addressing some of the concerns that were brought up in the previous episode in order to affect the sort of positive changes we want? Plus, if you stick around to the end, I promise you it's going to get a little spicy, because one of the homework assignments for each one at the table today was we had to come up with, okay, if we had to rebuild, If the fight gets so bad that we had to rebuild and we had to come up with some changes to the system as it currently exists in order to prevent the bad things from happening, what would that look like? And I may have forced certain people at the table into certain roles that they're going to have to play, certain things that they're going to have to advocate for, which I definitely think you will find interesting. So all of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Yes, which is why today we're talking about the purge or mass deportation of leftists. I'm not sure. One of the two.
This is, you will all see what the country looks like with Generalissimo Tina. And then we will also be hearing from Christian, first of his name, keeper of the scrolls, resident historian, political prognosticator, God save the king. How are you doing, Christian?
I think I'm going to make a lot of people angry in this episode.
We will definitely break down into our respective factions. I don't know. Maybe there'll be a Minecraft battle later on all of it. All right.
What a dork.
Yeah.
All
right. Let's go into kind of like a quick recap of what we talked about last episode. So the author was Carl Schmitt. And again, he's very controversial because he wrote this book, The Concept of the Political, along with many other writings. He served in a variety of functions, but he was also doing this in a little period called 1930s and 40s Germany. So that kind of speaks for itself on the problems with Carl Schmitt. And he is a very problematic guy. I am not what you would call a Carl Schmitt fan by any stretch of the imagination, but he did have a very interesting critique of classical liberalism. Now, again, classical liberalism is not modern liberalism. It's this idea of things like representative government, universal suffrage, constitutional government, separation of powers. Essentially, it's kind of the breaking away from what was really millennia's worth of government systems, which are largely based off of power structures and the ability to impose one's power on a different group or within an empire setting on many different civilizations, with one that was governed by the consent of the people, but which was also largely rooted in ideas of individual liberty, private property rights. There was a free market component to a lot of classical liberalism, the idea that everybody has inherent value. These were all positive manifestations of classical liberalism, but what Carl Schmitt pointed out was that there was also some other problems with the way that classical liberalism had developed. And it was this idea that no matter what you're talking about or what your system of government is, what he described as the sovereign is the person that is going to get to decide the exceptions to the rules, especially in moments of crisis. He also pointed out that by classical liberalism essentially pretending that everybody could get along and happily coexist and share a country together, even when they had diametrically opposed worldviews, is something that it was just not really feasible. It was pretending that it could pretty much, smooth out all the rough parts of civilization by just coming up with a constitution or processes by where you elected representatives of the sovereign. And then eventually that would break down. And the reason why he believed it would break down is because he thought the very nature of politics was what he referred to as the friend-enemy distinction. And when it comes to existential differences. The friend and enemies on the opposite sides of those existential questions, they're not going to just peacefully figure it out simply because they're allowed to vote, right? They're going to fight over who gets power, and then they're going to impose their will on the others. And the quicker somebody actually recognizes politics as the friend-enemy distinction, the more their tactics will change in order to get power so they can impose their will and defeat their enemies. Now, one of the things that we discussed about was we had something of a critique because I believe he created something of a straw man of classical liberalism. I think that he accurately depicted certain people and certain thinkers within classical liberalism, but I thought he was a little bit too broad in his approach. However, that doesn't take away the fact that we're living in a time right now where very obviously, and we pointed this out in the last episode, the left has been treating the right as if we are the enemy, as if we are evil, and we've been treating the left as if we just disagree on policy, right? We're all Americans. We all want the same things. We just kind of disagree on how to get there. Well, we're quickly coming to the realization that that's not true, that we now are facing a movement within the left in the United States. It's actually, I would argue, the predominant movement within the left that doesn't want the same country, that doesn't want the same things, that actually has a vision of America that is diametrically opposed to the vision that most of us on the right have for America. And while there may be certain areas where we can still agree on things, overall, we don't want the same things. And here's the best manifestation of this that I can come up with. When you're arguing about tax rates, or when you're arguing about a transportation project, or when you're arguing about the proper role of government within a welfare state, as soon as the argument immediately breaks down to you're a bad person, you're evil, you're bigoted, you're racist, you're sexist, even if you haven't actually demonstrated any of the characteristics, attributes, statements, or actions which would fall neatly into those categories, you may find yourself in what would be called a friend-enemy distinction. That person has classified you as an enemy now, and what are you? You're not just wrong on policy. You're bad, you're evil, and you need to be defeated. And by making you bad and evil, you create a moral justification whereby they can use force in order to restrict you, harm you, confiscate from you, potentially even kill you. The problem is that when you find yourself in a situation when you are seen as an enemy, but you see the other person as just a friend that you disagree with, the fight is going to look very, very one-sided. As one person has pointed out and as Christian has quoted several times in this episode, the side that wants to be left alone will be beaten by the side that wants to win. So the question that we're going in today is, now that we kind of understand this concept of the friend-enemy distinction, now that we understand these concepts of some of the critiques of classical liberalism, the question is can we actually save the country based off of the point that it's currently at and the things that we're watching unfold? And if we can save it, what would need to happen in order to do that? Then we're going to go into a separate question, and that is, are we so far gone that a fight, a significant fight, a real one, is imminent? And then finally, we're going to get to the question of, assuming that that fight was won, what would we change in order to prevent it from happening in the future? So those are the three things those are the three broad categories that we're really going to go in today and talking about this. But before we get to that, I think it's important to understand that I don't completely subscribe to the friend-enemy distinction. But I do believe, and I've come to this conclusion after many years of actually being in politics, of being in the General Assembly, that I am seen as an enemy by many of my colleagues. And it's frustrating because I don't want to be seen that way. But as we always said in combat, the enemy always gets a say. You can plan whatever you want, you can have whatever intentions you want, but when you launch your operation, the other side gets a chance too. They get to decide what it is that they want to do. And if they're going to treat you like an enemy, you have to accept that, right? And you have to respond accordingly. Now, that doesn't mean you have to adopt all of the tactics of the enemy, but you have to be aware of the operational environment if you actually want to affect any sort of positive change. And before you do any of that, you better be dressed right. And that's where True Classic comes into play. Because True Classic, I got to tell you right now, I'm actually wearing one of my True Classic tees right now. I have promised that one of these episodes, I'm going to actually wear the button downs because I've always loved, again, the way I got into True Classic clothing was their t-shirts. Tina bought me a bunch of t-shirts. I was like, why'd you buy me these? And then I put them on. I was like, ooh, I like how it's a little tighter around the shoulders and chest and a little bit more roomy in other areas of the body. But again, they feel great. They're awesome. Now they've got a whole line of workout wear. That's what I wear to the gym as well, as I wear the True Classic, the gym stuff. But where they have now completed my ensemble, as they would say, is the button downs, because, oh man, that is super comfortable.
If you wear that across the table from me, I cannot make any promises about what kind of show this might be.
And guys, that's how you know. That's how you know the clothing line is good. If your wife likes it on you, she probably wants to also take it off you. So, trueclassic.com. If you go to trueclassic.com and you do /Nick, all right, you're going to go ahead and get that perfect blend of everything that you need within the True. And again, they've got everything. They've got the sports stuff. They've got the casual wear. They've got the more formal wear. They've got the jeans. They got the shorts. It really is great. Check it out. And the way you want to buy from True Classic is you want a bundle. Right, you're not going to True Classic to buy one or two T-shirts. You want to go to True Classic and you want to look at it like, okay, what's a section of my wardrobe that I want to improve? Right, what's something that I want to feel good? Because guys, look, now more than ever, we need to feel confident about just who we are and how we look. That's a part of what it is. We want our ladies to be happy with how we look. Right, we want to look good at the gym. Right, so go there, trueclassic.com, get that bundle. You're going to be happy with it, I promise you. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. So we have now explained, we've done a brief recap, friend-enemy distinction, what Carl Schmitt was talking about. We've talked about how the friend-enemy distinction seems to be playing out within American society right now. Again, I've expressed how I felt for a while. We've talked about not only the friend-enemy distinction, we've also talked about Antonio Gramsci and the March to the Institutions. And one of the things that I was speaking at an event last week, and I had somebody say, Nick, you talk about these problems within the federal bureaucracy, and you talk about the problems within higher education and arts and entertainment, but Nick, we can't surrender these institutions. And I remember looking back and I said, let me tell you what I mean by that. When the right is in charge of an institution, the left gets a seat at the table. Because we believe in freedom of inquiry, we believe in freedom of speech, we believe in the fair exchanging of ideas, and we believe that those ideas should be able to rise to the top based off of their merit. But here's what we repeatedly find. When the left comes on and they start to control a majority of the seats, what they do is they push the right off. And then they close the doors, they bring up the ladders, and no more conservatives are getting into these institutions, and they increasingly march more and more to the left as time goes on. So that even if you wanted to compete for the board of Harvard, how do you plan to do that? What's your strategy? Is that the best use of your time and resources to try to infiltrate back into Harvard and take it back over from within, even though you know they are specifically organized in such a way as to prevent you from doing so? Or is it better to come up with alternative Harvard? So what we're going to talk about right now is that if we recognize that the friend-enemy distinction is in play, that when the left says they think we're evil and mean and horrible, bigoted, fascist threats to democracy, they actually mean it. This is not just some sort of campaign slogan, that on some level they believe that's true. What that means is they have perfect moral justification to exclude your access, to deplatform you, to censor you, because after all, you're a threat to public safety. You're a threat to democracy. And what could be more important than democracy and public safety? So they're willing to use power in order to first exclude you and secondly punish you. The question is that as we look at the important culturally shaping institutions within our country, if we want to save it from continuing to go down the direction it is, if we actually want to stop it, turn it around, and move it in the opposite direction, you have to selectively pick what are the institutions that you can compete for and what are the institutions you can compete against. And we've broken a lot of these down into categories such as education, that's both higher education as well as primary education. We've talked about politics and the political realm. We've talked about journalism. We've talked about the church. We've talked about arts and entertainment. So we can kind of look at these as, Hollywood, the media, the higher education, the public school system, and then obviously your local, state, and federal government. So what we're going to talk about right now, first of all, is what in these institutions, what is the criteria for competing within them and competing with them from the outside? Go ahead, Christian.
Well, you burn down the institutions that you can't save and you build new ones in their place. And then you gatekeep the left out of power. I said that I was going to maybe offend a few people in this podcast.
Yeah.
Look, you and I have a few disagreements here because when I read Concept of the Political, I was like, I've believed in this stuff all along in terms of the framework, right? we don't need to go through the caveats of Schmidt's own personal background, right? We're just talking about the framework of what he wrote about. I've always been more on the confrontational side. And then when I read this, it just clicked with me so simple. Like, this is what politics is. This is the nature of the political. This is to quote the book, the concept of the political. And we see so many examples of this. So many examples of the left hijacking an institution, hijacking a country at this point, gatekeeping anybody that doesn't agree with them ideologically out of that institution, and then weaponizing that institution against the other side. There's so many examples of this.
Well, James Lindsay talks about that there's something of a 4-step process. The first process is that they'll ask for access. So they'll look at your organization and they'll say, well, no one on your organization looks like me or thinks like me, and so I need a seat at the table. And so you'll give them a seat at the table. And the next thing that they'll ask for is accommodation. You have to change the way your organization operates in order to better reflect people like me and our concerns and our issues with respect to the way that you operate. Then it will be, I need more seats at the table so that we can affect the sort of positive change that we need. And then eventually it's, you're no longer allowed at this table because you're a threat. And he goes, and that's kind of and I butchered it. He does a better job of explaining it, but that's how he explains how essentially a leftist or a woke ideology will come in and take over an institution. So I guess what I'm wondering is this: we're not going to set up an alternative to the Congress, right? I'm not going to set up an alternative to the Virginia House of Delegates. So I see those as areas where we've got to compete within them. We've got to get people to actually run for office, but they have to be people that understand this dynamic. Because I can tell you right now, there are far too many Republicans that still think we're in 1980s America where, yeah, we all agree that the Soviets are bad, but, you know, we disagree on what should the top marginal income tax rate be. Like, that is not the nature of the disagreement anymore.
Well, we need to replace Congress. So can I answer the question too, real quick? We need to replace, first of all, people in Congress with people that understand that we need to defund higher ed and defund education completely. No more government funds, no more government subsidization of loans, and stop that completely. The government should be out of the business of doing loans. It's ridiculous. It's totally wrong anyway. It's outside the scope of what the government should have been doing anyway. People are already starting to self-sort in this way. There are a lot of people that are starting to look at trades again, which I think is far more valuable than most of these degree programs. And so it's already sort of happening. And so what I want is in education, defunding these things. I think that's probably the hardest thing that we have to do. The rest of these things are actually happening on their own already. And that's what I love. So first of all, journalism. Big media is totally dying out. We can look at who gets their news, even from CNN, ABC, or even Fox News at this point. Fox News is kind of on top right now.
On the cable.
But even they, on cable network news, even they are dying out. And what are they dying out to? Well, Twitter is the fastest place to get your news at this point. You've kind of got to weed through and figure out what's real and what's not real. But you can see it happening as it develops. You can watch what happens and go, okay, here's the news. I can sort through this myself. I don't need some talking head to break it all down for me. I can figure this out for myself. And all that means is you have to let some people be wrong, and who cares about that? They're going to be wrong anyway if the network news has anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. So just let that happen. Also, arts and entertainment. Hollywood is dying. What's taking its place? YouTube. You got YouTubers, you've got Instagrammers, you've got people, wasting their life away 30 seconds at a time flipping through. Whoa. That's how we get entertained now. And even with movie projects and things like that, most of us would rather just get on YouTube and watch it. And so I feel like some of this is kind of already happening, and it's exactly what I think needs to happen. We're starting to get our ideas out there. What I do think, though, is the more it happens, the more you're going to see the divide, and people start getting really scared of that divide. They're like, oh my gosh, we're getting so divided. And I'm like, no. Let's go ahead. Like, force people into their camps. Get all these independents to stop him-hawing around and trying to make everybody happy. Like, no, decide where you stand and get there.
It's interesting that you point out higher ed, and this is the reason why, again, you're not going to set up an alternative Congress, so you got to compete for Congress. You're not going to set up an alternative state house, you got to compete for the state house. But it is interesting how much the left pushes to take over institutions which are federally or basically just tax subsidized in general. And if they're not directly tax subsidized, they will seek to increase ways in which they can be tax subsidized. So you see this with higher ed, you see this with Hollywood, you see Hollywood cozying up to Gavin Newsom during COVID. So Newsom's, shutting down businesses left and right if you're a mom and pop, but when it comes to Hollywood, they get all these special either bailouts or special exceptions to the rules so that they're allowed to continue to operate. And it's always based off this idea, well, they're so important to the economy. Well, is it that they're so important to the economy, or is it that they're so important to you, Gavin? And I think we need to understand that many of the area, there is no equivalent to this on the right. You could, once upon a time, they would argue that, well, finance gets certain protections from the government. Well, actually, there's probably more federal institutions and government institutions designed to regulate and control finance than to give them special advantages. Or you could say there's things like oil and gas. Like oil and gas, overwhelmingly give to conservatives. Trial lawyers and teachers unions overwhelmingly give. Well, wait a second. Again, when you look at these teachers unions, they give almost like 99% to Democrats. When you look at abortion, the abortion industry, they give all this money to Democrats, and they also get direct subsidization from the government with very little regulation or oversight in comparison. And so the left creates this scenario where their clients, their base, can come to the public treasury in order to get money. And if you oppose that, it's not that you oppose taxpayer subsidization of abortion. No. They'll claim you oppose women's health care. It's not that it's not that you oppose taxpayer subsidization of political indoctrination within the schools. You oppose public schools and teachers, right? So they create this dynamic where they now put themselves in a position to directly fund their ideological allies with conservative tax dollars, and then slam you if you got a problem with it. So you got to compete within the political realm. But to your point, when it comes to things like higher education, we're going to get a little bit later into what you can do with this as an individual, but higher education, I think you're absolutely right. I think any conservative in the political realm needs to start looking very, very seriously at the amount of tax dollars that go to the institutions of higher education, abortion. We also need to look at, why does the federal government even playing a role in manipulating education? It's not their role. It appears nowhere really in the Constitution. You could talk a little bit about I think it was the Northwest Ordinance, but it just doesn't make sense, and it's just funding. It's fueling political enemies. Same thing with we have Hollywood tax credits in Virginia. I'm like, why? Well, we want to encourage people to do movies out here. Do we? Why do I want to encourage Hollywood to come to Virginia? Why is that a priority? Why is that? I got a question. If taxpayers in Virginia want that, you know what they could do? They could pay to see more Hollywood movies, or they could offer up their own environments, land, properties, and whatever else to Hollywood in order to produce it. Here's what my constituents don't need. My constituents don't need me either taxing them or creating special breaks for somebody else for which the burden will then fall on them later in order to entice somebody to come out here to share values that disagree with my constituents. I don't need to do that I don't need to do that on the left's behalf. And
I've got a better question.
Yeah.
Why are we giving money to our enemies?
That's the point.
It's not just inviting Hollywood in will turn the state blue. It's you're enriching your enemies at the same time it'd be bad enough.
You are impoverishing your own side to enrich your enemies.
And we do this all the time. How many times have I live in Virginia, so do you, obviously. How many times have we seen in the 20-something years that I've lived here, 25 years that I've lived here, I have seen Republicans over and over and over again pander to federal government employees in Fairfax County in Virginia. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about elected officials in Richmond. This was long before you were elected office, right? Over and over and over again, pandering to the side that then turns around and votes against us.
Yeah.
We were subsidizing the beast as it was growing out of Northern Virginia and spreading its tendrils along I-95 and Route 66. And now we've gotten to a point where our state's flipped blue.
Yeah.
And at some point, we should not be surprised that elements within the right have woken up to this and realized that half of our half of our leadership are fools. Mm-hmm. What we have right now is we have a left that loves to punch right and pander left. They don't crack down on the radicals at all.
No.
They will defeat them in a primary if they think that it'll cost them in the general election, but they'll nurture them. They'll tolerate their existence. They'll subsidize their existence. All that they will do is they will punch right and pander left. And it just so happens we have a right in this country that also loves to punch right and pander left. And luckily, over the last few years, I'd really say since COVID, since 2020, arguably since 2016, but it really has ramped up since 2020, we now have a flourishing of a right. It's not a majority of the right yet, but there's a subsegment of the right in this country that now realizes that our own side has been acting like controlled opposition. And I don't mean this in the conspiratorial sense, right? I don't mean this in the Manchurian Candidate sense. What I mean is functionally, the right has been impotent. They've been incapable of actually pushing back. The way that you push back is, well, we've talked about it on this podcast at length. We need to build counter institutions to the ones that currently exist that the left has hijacked.
So let's ask that question real quick. So if we agree that you're not going to, so you still have to fight for politics, and once you get into politics, it's not just good enough to say, oh, I have a Republican representative. You have to have somebody that actually understands the nature of the fight and will basically defund the beast, and certainly not fund it with our constituents' tax dollars. Right, so you have to have that distinction, and you should be looking very, very closely at your, not just your federal, but your state representatives to see who does that and who doesn't. When it comes to things like higher ed, okay, you're probably not going to infiltrate, Harvard or pretty much almost any public university and make it significantly more conservative. The best you can do maybe is hope that your physics department is a little bit more conservative, but we see it over and over again. Your education departments, the very people that are producing the teachers, right? They are like overwhelmed. It's not 90% left wing on that. It's like 98% left wing within the educational departments. And we're not talking about left wing like, oh, Hillary Clinton, it takes a village. No, we're talking about like critical pedagogy. So if you're not going to take that over because they've already reached a point where they can gatekeep you out, how do you set up alternatives to higher education? And not just trades, right? Like, how do you set up alternatives to higher education where you are providing degree programs that operate within the realm of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, et cetera, stuff like that?
I think higher education is starting to render itself obsolete, at least in a brick and mortar sense, unless you're doing something that requires, like, let's say you want to be an engineer or a doctor or an architect, or, you want to do something that's a much more technical education type of thing, maybe in healthcare or what. Those type of things are starting, they still make sense. Okay. So it still makes sense to have brick and mortar for those type of things where you need to have labs and
Sure.
things like that. But overall for higher education, information and educational materials have never been easier to get. It's never been, you don't even have to pay for the knowledge anymore.
Well, but
in order to put together maybe a program where you'll get a certification for the knowledge you have, but in order to get that knowledge, you don't need that anymore.
Well, the interesting part too is understand that the way that politics manipulates things in favor of higher education is not just with respect to the massive subsidization of programs. It's also with creating licensing requirements and then allowing higher ed to be the only institutions capable of awarding you the appropriate credentials in order to be able to even compete within a particular field. And so there is even a political concept of this too, of not just restricting funds, but also saying you're no longer going to get this privileged place in society where you get to be the only one that hands out this credential. The credential is going to be based off of whether or not you can actually perform the good or service within the marketplace. And there's plenty of consumer-based organizations which can bless the Better Business Bureau. Mm-hmm. The Better Business Bureau is not a government agency.
I feel like this would really resolve itself in large part if there was no more government subsidization and of the schools themselves, and no more government subsidization of the loans.
Yeah.
As soon as the loans go private, you can get a loan, but a private organization that is issuing loans, they expect to get paid back.
Yeah.
So you better be getting a valuable education. And so on the other end, then the free market takes over, and it'll naturally weed this stuff out if you just get government out of it.
I think it's important for people to understand how big a threat federal bureaucracy has become, state bureaucracy has become. It's actually interesting how many writers have come to the conclusion that bureaucracy is one of the greatest threats, because bureaucracy has kind of this unholy alliance with part of the voting population. There's a really interesting video called The Anthropology of Karens that was put out by Rudyard Lynch over at What If Alt Hist, where he talked about kind of this weird alliance between the bureaucracy and again, the woman, the Karen that is always asking to speak to the manager, right? The bureaucracy gives her power because she doesn't actually have the power to impose anything. She relies on the manager. She relies on the bureaucracy.
The managerial class.
Yes, and the bureaucracy has an incentive to basically put the focus on problems which can't ultimately be solved, because then it always justifies more money and power for the bureaucracy. So we're not going to put the emphasis on, again, you want to solve a lot of the climate crisis, right? If you think that's a big issue, then you're going to switch to nuclear energy. Why does the bureaucracy not want nuclear energy? Well, because it doesn't solve their problem, which is, how do I come up with problems that effectively can't be solved but can always be used to justify an increase in my power and budget? So combating and decreasing the size of the bureaucracy almost never works in favor for the conservative worldview. It always works in favor for the leftist worldview. And so we should see it almost, again, it's not to say that there aren't certain bureaucratic elements that are necessary for basic functioning, but we should always see the bureaucracy as we should always be skeptical of the bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy almost always equals meddling.
Yes.
Almost always equals, we're going to do this for your own good. So bureaucracy, its greatest tool is coercion.
Yeah. Well, and so much now, because legislators, and I know this, I'm a legislator, legislators have a natural incentive to not want to fully take responsibility for something that goes on, right? They're always, in politics, there's always this idea where if you can't take credit for something, you sure as hell want to be able to blame somebody else for it. And what they've done now, and part of this is practical, and part of it is, I believe, ideological and strategic, is they'll say, well, we're not gonna write the specific laws necessary to achieve our end state. We're going to write laws in order to give an executive bureaucracy the authority to write rules and regulations and assess penalties and fines in order to achieve said end state. And then it goes into effect. You get to stand back and say, I voted for clean air. Right? I didn't vote for the executive branch to create 1,000 pages of new regulations to include a whole series of Byzantine fines, rules, and regulations would make it impossible for you to run your business. No, I voted for clean air.
That's the
bureaucracy
defense.
did that. Yes, the bureaucracy did that. But then the bureaucracy feeds back into the politicians that give them the power. And so, again, there's this unholy alliance, which is a complete, bastardization of what that constitutional setup was supposed to be. So I think, again, when you're looking at who do you elect, if you can't have a conversation with a politician, elected representative, where they can actually express to you the problem within the bureaucracy and give you real solutions on how they would actually take it down, they're not serious. You need to understand this. They're not serious. They are about maintaining the status quo for which they have found a way to fit into the status quo.
And here's how you know that the voters aren't serious either, is because year after year after year, we try to get people to pay attention, to ask these questions. We try to give them information, and year after year, they just get duped. This is the thing, is politicians who lie get elected all the time because people are stupid and they fall for the lie. And it's not just people that are stupid, because all the people watching this, I'm not saying you're stupid. You're watching us. You must be brilliant. But what I'm trying to say is there are these people right in the middle, independents, who it's like, I want to make them pick a side. It's like, you can't sit here and go, well, I kind of think transing kids is okay. Like, I'm kind of okay with grooming kids over here, but I'm kind of not okay with it over here. No, pick a side. We are at that point. Like, you better decide what you believe. But here's the problem, is you've got all these people walking around acting like they're just so magnanimous, and they have like they're so intellectual that they really can't fall hard on one side or the other. It's not because they're intellectuals. It's because they're morons with no morals whatsoever. They don't know what they believe. They just go with whatever the popular people want. Those are followers. They're sheep. They just go wherever the wind blows. And I just feel like, if you call yourself an independent, I have beef with you.
Well, I'll say this. I understand people that don't want to necessarily be associated with a particular political party. I get that. I don't understand people that show up on election day still not knowing who they're going to vote for.
No, they go in and they're like, this guy's eyes, they're a lot more kind than the other guy's eyes.
But here's the distinction between independent, which is someone that might say, I don't want to affiliate with a particular political party because I think they're crap, versus someone that has no idea where they land on anything. And again, another thing Rudyard pointed out, and one of the things he was talking about was the polling kind of actually plays this out. A lot of the people that are, quote, undecided, it's not because they're on some sort of superior intellectual plane and really considering all the ins and outs. It's because they don't care, and then will pick whatever they will pick to rule them whoever they feel the nicest about on election day. And he described it as normie midwits, right? Like, it's more of like, I want to feel like I'm with the cool kids. Which candidate feels like they're with the cool kids, and I'll vote for them. Now let's talk about one other more before we move on to the next topic.
Hold on. Can I just say, when I say independent, I actually meant people in the middle, the undecideds. I shouldn't have said independent. It's undecideds, moderates, that type of terminology. I understand some people don't want to say I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. I'm not talking about labels here. I'm talking about people that are in the middle that just sway one side or the other and decide all of our elections because of their stupidity. And
not based off of any sort of core convictions or understanding of policy, but rather just show. Taylor Swift told me to vote. Right? Like, that's stupid. Matthew Holloway, thank you for the super chat. He goes, what is your opinion on government-funded research in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, etc.? Once upon a time, I would have said yes. If we can look at some of these more objective hard sciences, well, then clearly there might be a role for some government funding. Increasingly, all that's become, though, is DEI has worked its way into everything. Math is now racist. Right? So I don't trust government funding of most of these institutions, because the institutions themselves, regardless of how hard the science is, if the, quote, hard science is located within an institution which has adopted the critical theory explanation of the world, then your funding is going to get used to come up with really bad physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. And so the question I would ask is there not enough interest within just civilization as a whole to fund some of this research? If it is, or if there is, well, then you don't need the government to fund it. If there isn't, well, then you have to ask the question, okay, well, then why do we need to fund it? If people don't want to voluntarily fund it, why should they be coerced and forced into funding it? So I've gotten to a point where I'm very, very skeptical of government funding of any of this stuff. Now, I will say that there are certain things which might be essential to the actual, like, let's say the federal government's role in society, which is to protect us from enemies, foreign and domestic, all right? Provide a peaceful, legal process with respect to domestic tranquility, and to prevent from foreign invasion. If in the service to those purposes, they are funding research in order to determine a better tank design, right? Or something else, I can see that falling under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution and being a legitimate function of government. But we're watching the government fund all kinds of things because it's all about scientific research. Well, again, I don't think scientific research should get to be a liberal professor at a liberal university getting subsidized by conservative tax dollars so they can come up with a study that shows that it's actually a good idea to trans 9-year-olds, right? Like, I'm sorry, I don't think that's a role for the federal government. I don't think it's a role for government in general. And again, I've increasingly become skeptical that they can ever just objectively fund science toward a very, say, pure and objective purpose. Okay, we got one other area I wanted to cover on this because we didn't cover it too much yet. And that's Tina Minchley briefing with the arts and entertainment. Are there any studios in Hollywood that you think conservatives have a shot? Are there any record labels that you think conservatives have a shot at competing for? Or is the future small independent creators on YouTube and like Angel Studios or something like that? Is it competing firms?
The future is decentralization.
Okay.
Yep.
Like this is even more so than education, an example of an institution that the left has hijacked that luckily they're delegitimizing themselves. They're doing our job for us, because one of the critical tasks that the right needs to do is delegitimize these institutions.
Yep.
Is destroy these institutions.
Yeah.
And there's actually not a whole lot of work that we need to do to make that happen, because they're destroying themselves, in part because the left can't make anything beautiful, but also because the left has to constantly reinforce the message, the revolution, right, in order to justify them hijacking and gatekeeping these institutions. This is why Disney can't make any good movies anymore, because they're always having to insert in something related to the revolution. I think everybody can already think of examples. Think about some of these movies that have bombed lately, like Lightyear and stuff like that. There's
the
so
Acolyte.
many. Acolyte.
But you've got to be okay. Just to be intellectually honest, though, I was watching with our kids some of the really old Looney Tune stuff, and they did back then. They wove in whatever the government message was at the time, especially about the health department. I remember an entire cartoon that interrupted the Bugs Bunny episode we were watching with the kids that talked about the health department and feeding your babies a bottle and the flies and how bad the flies are. And this is why we have the health department and why you should do this.
Well, nobody denies that,
what I'm trying to say
has
is propaganda has always been there. It just used to be a lot more overt. You knew that this was a PSA from the government. You knew that. Now it's not. It's society's little alternative government thing.
I don't think anybody's denying that propaganda has always existed within mass media. I mean, the arts historically were usually patroned by kings and emperors, right? In order to glorify their own, we want a battle. Let's get a sculptor.
The aristocracy was the
I would also argue that a lot of that
arts.
stuff was also beautiful too. A lot of like sculptures and paintings from the past that were commissioned.
Because it turns out when you're spending money on yourself, you're really concerned about quality and price.
Yes.
Right now the government's spending other people's money on other people, and so they don't care what the building or the sculpture looks like. The crappier the better.
But like the point is that you're not going to get rid of that, right? You're not going to get rid of propaganda, small p. I don't mean big P.
Right.
Propaganda within, because everybody has an agenda. Nobody's neutral. It goes back to Schmidt's whole point. Nobody's neutral about anything, right? The question is, A, are we going to be subsidizing the left's propaganda to indoctrinate our own people, especially our own children, into hating us and joining their side? And B, are we going to allow them to continue to gatekeep an entire industry that is crucial to politics? Gramsci was absolutely right when he talked about the power of culturally shaping institutions. His concept of cultural hegemony, he is correct on this point. Yeah. He's wrong about the world that he wants to bring about, but he's correct about his analysis of the importance of culturally shaping institutions. So yes, we should be delegitimizing these institutions. We should be deconstructing them. We should be defunding them. And dare I say it, when it's applicable, we should be wielding government power to target them. DeSantis was absolutely right to go after Disney the way that he did in Florida, and he destroyed them in the state of Florida, and that's a good thing. And for anybody on the right that's going to get upset at Christians suggesting, how dare you do this? What do you want me to do? Is it principled for us to just lose? You have to understand the stakes that we're in right now. If we lose, Western civilization is gone forever. If the left gets the vision that they want, the totalizing, egalitarian, cultural Marxist vision, everything that you believe in, I'm talking about basic fundamental building blocks here, all of it is gone. All of it is gone. The Christian worldview, the classical, Greco-Roman, philosophical worldview, all of that stuff that is the basic building blocks of what the United States is and what we on the right believe in by virtue of being on the right, all of that is gone. And if your objection is, wow, I can't believe DeSantis passed a bill stripping Disney of any sort of special privileges. And you know what? If it's, I can't believe that DeSantis is saying you're not allowed to use your funding in order to try to overturn, because Disney said they wanted to overturn a law that was passed in Florida. They wanted to pass, they wanted to push the legislature in order to overturn that parental rights and education bill. And DeSantis pointed out, you are my enemy. You want to strip parents of their right to have a say in how the raising of their children are. I will come after you.
Yeah.
And in defense of that thing, and for conservatives to come back and say, how dare you use the government to target Disney? Well, guess what? How dare Disney try to tell the legislature in Florida and parents in Florida whether or not they should have a say in the raising of their children? I will absolutely do almost anything in order to defend that. We were having a debate right before the podcast on
All right, well,
we draw the line. We'll get to that later in the episode.
Yeah, we got some super chats. I want to give Matt Turner, thank you very much. He goes, thoughts, student loan max amount tied directly to the median grad salary of a grad from a school with that degree and have a max total interest amount. So the idea would be that when you get a loan to go to college, they're going to look at your degree program. They're going to look at what you do. They're going to say, okay, the loan's going to be tied to whether or not, what's the amount that you would get paid, or the amount that an average student would get paid with that degree from that institution, and then you fix it. Here's what I'm going to say. If the private sector wants to do that, fine. I just don't want the government to do it. And I get this all the time with people saying, oh, I guess you just don't want poor people to go to college. No, what I don't want is for the government to manipulate universities' curriculum and studies based off of using tax dollars for the process. And that's what's been going on. They've been manipulating both the universities and they've been manipulating the voting population by essentially sending them to what are in many respects becoming indoctrination mills. And I don't think you should get to use people's money against their will for that purpose. And so I got no problem with student loans. I got a problem with the government being in the student loan business because on a fundamental level, it is always going to be perverted toward political objectives as opposed to just strictly educational or economic objectives.
It's just not the realm the government should be in.
No, it just isn't.
And this idea where it's like, I just don't want poor people to go to college. I'm at the point where I don't want anyone to go to college. So I just putting that out there.
Also, Bayfire 213, thank you very much. First super chat, appreciate it. He goes, just want to thank you all for what you do. Found your channel through Nick's interview with Joel Salatin. Yeah, Joel's great, man. I love that guy. Didn't want to vote just to vote. Didn't feel like my vote would matter. First time voter this year. Thank you very much. Again, it is really important. This is an area we still have to compete for. But again, your civic duty is not just to vote, right? Your civic duty is to understand what you're voting for, what policies you might be supporting, what sort of impact that could have. I always tell people, if you have no idea who to vote for, don't vote that year. Again, your civic duty is to be an informed voter, not just to cast a vote based off of what Taylor Swift says. Okay, let's go into this next category that I wanted to hit on here. And this goes into the whole idea of, okay, we've talked a little bit about what needs to happen, right? That's the idea of identify an institution. So you have the realms, right? The realms is arts and entertainment. The realms is higher education. The realm is politics. The realms is journalism. But then you have institutions within it. I don't think it makes sense to waste a lot of time trying to infiltrate and take over Harvard. I think the left has such ideological capture of that institution that they would never allow you the opportunity to even be able to do it. Now, there may be somebody that is maybe it's their alma mater, maybe they're a big donor, maybe it's something like that, and they actually do have the ability to perhaps influence things on some level. If that's your mission and you just feel a calling to it, I get it. I get people fighting for institutions that they desperately care about. But on a general level, and again, I had to express this to this one teacher. I said, look, on a general level, I'm not going to tell the individual, the mom and pop, whatever it is, I'm not going to tell you to fight to try to take over an institution for which there's very little probability that your contribution to that fight will have any impact. And so the real question is okay, from an individual level, what are ways that you can have the greatest impact possible? And the argument that I've always used is that it's always going to be with respect to your own children, right? Your own children are the next. I love it where the politically children are the future. Yeah, no kidding, jackass, right? Like, yeah, you're right. The people that are coming in the future are the future.
Right.
That is true. Yeah, tomorrow is also the future. But the question is that because that is true, that is fundamentally true. The argument is okay, what are you doing? You have a certain amount of time with your kids. It's limited. It's finite. But you can maximize it within those first 18 years. You can maximize it. Now, what we have found is that a lot of the behavioral traits that we see are not something that develop in the teen years. It's something that develop at 3, 4, 5 years old. Mm-hmm. And if certain things take place at 3, 4, 5 years old, it's going to be very hard to either correct for later on in life. Jordan Peterson was actually having a really interesting discussion on concepts of narcissism. And he was talking about how ideas of self-interest are good, competitiveness, good. someone who has a high degree of extroversion and a high degree of disagreeableness, that's probably your CEO, that's your general, that's your somebody, that's your leader within an area. Why? Because they're very motivated to go out there and talk and work and compete and collaborate, but they also don't suffer fools well, right? They don't mind being in high stress, difficult situations where they have to make important decisions. If you funnel that in the right direction early on in life, which means you socialize your children properly, and that doesn't mean handing them off to daycare. It means you socialize your children properly. They go on the CEO track, right? If you don't socialize them properly, they go on the narcissist cluster B personality disorder track. And again, we're talking extremes here, right? Mm-hmm. But they're far more likely to go into an environment where now all of a sudden they use that extroversion and they use that disagreeableness not to be good competitors, right? But to be really good manipulators, potentially abusive, mentally or physically. And so the reason why I mention all this is because as individuals, you have the most power over the future by how you raise and spend time with your children. And I think it needs to be acknowledged that the more separation you have with your kids when they're, infants, 1, 2 toddlers, 1, 2, and 3, you may be thinking this isn't especially formative years. It is what we know now is it is absolutely critical to their social, emotional, and intellectual development and the bonding that they have with you as a parent. What you should also understand is the people that are pushing so hard to get your child out of your arms and into daycare, they're not doing that because they realize you need to go back to work because you got your career, you go girl. They're doing that because many of them believe in the collectivized raising and education of children.
And they package it up as, we need more funding for early childhood education. This isn't early childhood education. This is daycare. This is, what we want to watch your kids so you can go make more money so we can tax the crap out of you and screw up your cost of living. It's that whole thing I think is going to resolve itself as well. There's more and more people that are choosing now to have one parent stay home with the kids or even utilize grandparents, although grandparents are actually a little bit of a relic now. I mean, people are having kids later and later and later, which means the grandparents are older and older and older, and a lot of them aren't even around anymore, or they can't even help with the kids anymore because they're too old. And so that's a sidebar, but hopefully we can start getting our side of we're the ones that are breeding. We're the ones that aren't killing our kids. So really we should be able to outpopulation them before too long. The only problem is if we're sending our kids to them for every single thing, then we shouldn't be surprised that our kids become the next, enemy.
Well, and again, this is where I truly want to encourage people that I'm not saying you have to homeschool. I'm not saying that you have to send your kids out of the government school system. I am saying that if you are not aware of what the government school system is teaching your children, or you're constantly having to compete with an environment that may be doing the opposite of what you want for your children, that's going to be problematic. If you are also growing with this idea that there is an enormous amount of pressure when you tell somebody that your kid is graduating from high school, the first question out of their mouth is, where are they going to college?
Yep.
And there's enormous amount of pressure to be able to say, oh, they're going here, they're going here, they're going there. It's almost like if they're not going to college next, you failed as a parent.
Right.
What I want you to understand is that is social engineering. That is social engineering to get you to believe that the only way that you can set your children up for social and economic success is, of course, if you are handing them off from one government institution and putting them into another, either government institution in the form of a public university or one that's heavily subsidized, or that is regurgitating and implanting the opinions of, again, the left. Mm-hmm. And I think as parents, we need to resist that. I know one of the things that
it's kind of an institutionalized way to looking. We have people that are pretty classic definition of being institutionalized. I mean, they go to the government schools from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. or thereabouts every single day for these months out of every single year. And then once they get done with that, they go to next, institutionalized, educational facility, and in order to learn to become educators at the other institution.
Yeah.
And so now they've lived their entire lives in the institution. Like most of the teachers have never done anything outside of education. They grew up in education, they went to higher education and went back into education. And it's just their brains have been completely hardwired by it.
Well,
and I'm not saying that all teachers are bad or anything like that, but I do think you should have enough self-awareness to go, are there certain ways that I think and certain patterns that I hold to purely because I was taught them by this government institution my entire life? You're institutionalized. I really feel like people are more and more needing to break out of that in order to regain some sense of reality again.
We have someone that I think we're going to have on the podcast here fairly shortly. She was actually a principal within the public school system, and now she's a big homeschool advocate, and she kind of explains like her journey through that. Matt Boudreau is someone we've also had on that has had kind of a similar experience within education. And a lot of what they focus on is this idea of making a distinction between education and schooling, and specifically government administered schooling. Mm-hmm. Here's all I'll say, because I want to move on to the next kind of things that individuals can do. You need to get out of this idea that the government is the one that should be telling you exactly what education looks like, and understand that in association with Gramsci, they didn't just say, here's a quote free service, which it isn't free, right? It costs trillions of dollars to run this massive government run system. They didn't just say, here we're going to take your money and now we're going to give it back to you in the form of education for your children. They're now increasingly creating social dynamics and cultural dynamics where if you don't do that, you're ostracized or you're treated as if you're a bad parent. And again, this is the part where you really have to start questioning that, just like you would question other things within society. If you're sitting here going, I really question the food pyramid. I can't believe the government got away with so long with selling this food pyramid on us, when now we're looking back and realizing like, oh my gosh, this was not only wrong, this was more and more, it's appearing to be a deliberate lie in order to achieve some other political and economic objective completely separate from health. Right. If you can see that within this realm, you need to start wondering if perhaps the same thing is going on within some of our educational institutions. And this is the one area as a parent where you can have one of the biggest impacts on taking back that time with your child. And so I think that's one thing that people should understand. Another thing, too, is we love the homesteader community. We love the homesteader community. We love the idea of building greater resilience on not being so, completely dependent upon the grocery store for everything. But I will say that there's a difference between community and isolation. You have some people that say, I just want to live off the grid. I just want to be by myself. And that's how I'm going to fight against everything that's going on. Look, I think you should be free to do that if that's what you choose. What I think you also need to understand is that you won't get to live like that if the left wins. Right? It's not like you're going to say, oh, I'll be fine when all this goes to crap because I'll have all my food. No, the government will have all of your food.
No, they will Ruby Ridge your...
Yeah, the government will have your food and you will have nothing, but they will thank you for all the food you stored up for them, right? Like, so I think it's important to understand that the way that you push back on this is not by completely separating yourself from the rest of society. The way that you push back on this is through more intentional community. And so and intentional community is not just these are the people I hang out with or these are the people I go to church with. Intentional community is more along the lines of these are the people that I also do business with. These are the people that I can also depend on in a difficult situation. One of the things that I know our church did with the whole idea of small groups, and part of the idea behind that was this idea of we weren't just going to come together in order to do an extra Bible study during the week. The whole idea of the small group was this is a close-knit group of people with shared values that can also be dependent upon for accountability, for support during crisis. Right? This is the sort of thing where if someone in your small group, if someone in your little group, it loses their job or has a big medical bill, what I'm talking about is the sort of community where it's understood that, well, of course, we're going to help you through this time and process because we're part of a community. And that community is not just geography. That community is not just proximity. That community is based off of shared values and an understanding that to some degree, part of what community means is helping one another when you need it, but also engaging in healthy transactions.
Mm-hmm. Voluntary.
Healthy voluntary transactions. Here's one of the things I realized when we first started getting into homesteading. my garden went from something really, really small to something fairly massive to something completely outside of my control, right? Like this last year, last year was nuts. I was like, oh man, like it all just kind of went to crap.
It didn't help that I went on carnivore and couldn't eat anything coming out of the garden.
But the other thing I realized was I have other people in my community that are really good at doing certain things, and I'm better at doing other things. And so specialization and division of labor is not bad.
No,
right?
it's not.
Trying to be an expert at everything is incredibly difficult to do.
We don't all need to do subsistence farming,
yes.
right?
So I would just say that one of the things that you can also do as an individual is focus on developing your own internal capabilities, which are not only useful for you, but also marketable. Because one of the things COVID taught me is there were certain things I wanted that the government told me, no. If you want that service, you have to go through what we've approved. And my attitude toward them was, yeah, no. I'll go get the services I want from the people I feel confident in their ability to provide it. Yes. And I'll be more than happy to pay them under the table and be really, really quiet about it.
Black market, baby.
And so I honestly believe...
Well, I guess it would be a gray market.
It'd be a gray market. I would honestly say that one of the things as an individual that you can do to fight back is that make yourself stronger, make yourself more competent and more capable. Because, again, the dirty little secret for a lot of this is it's not as if the federal government could call up right now and have the 82nd Airborne Division descend on your county and force you to do everything, right? They rely on a certain amount of dependency on the very systems that they've put in place in order to keep you in line.
I have a question about that, if you will permit me to deviate just a little bit from our outline here.
Yeah.
This is a question that I was asking you before we turned the cameras on, but since we're live, I really want to ask this now. So you told me yesterday and this morning that you agreed partially with Schmitt's critique of liberalism.
Yeah.
But you also thought that it was a bit of a straw man.
Yeah.
I'm going somewhere with this, I promise.
Okay.
You just mentioned something a second ago, right? That you know, it's not like the federal government will drop in the 82nd Airborne in order to force you, to do X, Y, or Z. The type of left-wing tyranny, anarcho-tyranny that we're living under is very different than the type of tyrannical rule that existed in, say, the Soviet Union.
It's not a totalitarian state.
Schmitt's concept of the total state I find to be very compelling. His idea that politics is now seeped into everything, and everything has become political, and therefore everything is a battleground. I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but we also know that the type of Marxist vision that's being imposed is, again, it's very different than the one that Lenin or Stalin pushed in Russia.
Yeah.
So why do you think that is, and does that tie into at all with your critique of Schmitt's critique of liberalism and how you think it's a bit incomplete or only correct in certain areas?
I think that, again, my larger critique of his critique of classical liberalism is I think he made classical liberalism too narrow in order to make his argument. And his narrow definition of classical liberalism is that it's essentially you've replaced the sovereign with a set of systems based off of the belief that everybody can live in peace with one another provided we just have elections. And I don't believe that's what classical liberalism is ultimately arguing for. I don't believe that's Lockean in nature. I don't believe Locke ever believed that you could put a bunch of people together who had diametrically opposed worldviews and they would all get together peacefully as long as there was a constitution and you got to vote. So I think that might be a little bit too narrow a definition of classical liberalism to accurately reflect at least what I believe, and I am in the classical liberal camp. By the same token, I do think he's right that too many people fail to see that there is a point to which people cannot peacefully coexist, and the best thing for them to do at that point is to separate.
Yes.
Right? The best thing for them to do at that point is to separate if they want to maintain peace. Now, the way that we tried to solve that within the American federalized system was the federal government's powers were limited and enumerated. The state government's powers were much more broad and not enumerated. And so the idea is that there were certain things that would unite all of us as Americans, and certain responsibilities that the federal government would take on, largely with respect to defense, some infrastructure, some communications, but primarily defense. And the end result would be is you could go to the state and impact the state in the way that you wanted in order to foster a more specific way to live. But we weren't going to try to do that across, at that time, 13 independent states. we were going to recognize that there's a problem with doing that there's just something about society which is not conducive to ruling, eventually what would become hundreds of millions of people from a centralized location on the Potomac. And I think that's largely correct. The libertarian would kind of argue that, well, no, there is an ideal, and the ideal is this, and that's the ideal we should all adopt. But they're not willing to use power to actually enforce it, which means they're never going to get it, because you got to convince people of that. So I do believe that the critiques of anybody that believes, and there's a large swath of Republicans, there's a large swath of libertarians that do seem to hold on to this belief that, well, hey, we all want the same things, we just kind of disagree on how to get there. That's not
I used
true.
to believe
anymore.
that. I
That's
used to
not
believe
true.
that.
Yeah,
And I don't
I
believe
used to
anymore.
too, to some degree. That isn't true. The problem that I have with the other part of his critique, and this goes, into your question, is the things that he offered as ways to combat that ended up being, I think, even worse than the disease.
Yeah, it's the old Stanford encyclopedia quote that he leveled a devastating critique, but his cure was worse than the disease.
And that kind of leads us into the next thing I want to talk about, and that is this idea of, we've talked about some of the things that we should do to fight this. You need to have representatives that understand the nature of the fight and are actually willing to wield government power, to your point, wield government power in an appropriate way that doesn't devastate the underlying foundations of what we believe as a country, right? Doesn't violate the belief in individual liberty, private property rights, free markets, the inherent worth and value, equality before the law, right? Like, how do you protect those things in such a way that doesn't require you to destroy them in the process in order to defeat your opposition? And we also need to be able to compete for those culturally shaping institutions. We need to compete within the institution or set something up to oppose the institution. So I agree with you. Disney at this point, I wish we could save it. I think it's just going to have to die.
A lot of these organizations and businesses, they committed suicide a long time ago, but they took a very slow pill to get there.
Well,
and I think that the enemy is really defining itself now. So.
No, the other thing is, and the same thing with education, right? Educational systems are so overwhelmingly influential on your population and on your children that you have to take a really hard look at whatever it is. If it's a university, if it's a school, if you are going to send your children to it, you have a requirement to understand exactly what they're going to be taught and whether or not that's going to facilitate the sort of character you want to see in your children. And if the answer is no, then you have to remove them from it. I see some people like, no, we got to fight for it. It's like, okay, and you may be able to fight in your individual school district in such a way as to actually affect the sort of change you want. But you also have to do an analysis of that. Are you capable of actually affecting that sort of change within your school system? If you live in Fairfax County, Virginia, the answer is no, you don't. I don't care who you are. I don't care how powerful you think you are. You don't. You are not going to fix any of these problems while your children are actually going to the institutions that you're trying to change. You're not. So you got to make a decision on what you want to do. That's the reality. Now, it could be that you pull your kid out and you still fight for the public school. I would understand that. I would get that. But just I want people to be aware of what the reality is and what the trade-off is. But that goes into this question, right? Is it too far gone? So and what I mean by too far gone is America just doomed and we're all, the black-pilled version of ourselves? That's not what I mean here. What I mean is it so far gone? Are we so far down the path with the march through the institutions? Are we so far down the path with the left becoming the full leftist Marxian version of itself as opposed to maybe more of just kind of a more liberal version of itself? Are we so far down that path that conflict is inevitable? And by conflict, I don't just mean a couple of riots. I don't mean the Summer of Love. I don't mean, January 6th. I mean, no kidding, we're at a point where you see state troopers standing on the line telling the feds, you will go no farther. This is Texas, right? It's Ron DeSantis kicking the envoy from the federal government into the pit saying this is Florida, right? Like, are we at a point where there is going to be some sort of conflict that is so significant that whatever happens after that is going to look different than the fundamental system that we have now? And I want to lead this question off by asking, Christian, is that sort of conflict, that conflict that could be existential, are we already at the point where that is going to happen?
Oh yeah. I thought the question was originally going to be, is it too far gone for us to do anything about it? And I was going to say no, because no situation's ever truly hopeless. Just go
Did
ask.
you guys hear Christian just
Like,
he said something hopeful.
Go ask the Visigoths that were holding out in the mountains in Asturias against the
I think going to Great Britain and like touching grass and going hiking was so good for you, Christian.
I've always believed that.
Okay, so let's let
Sorry,
him
go
finish.
ahead.
I want to hear this.
Look at the Reconquista. That's a really good example, right? At one point,
Yeah, but in all those cases, there was a major conflict in between. It wasn't. So let me put this: the Visigoths didn't just vote harder and get a better Caesar.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah.
Like we're definitely here's the thing. As I said at the beginning of this episode, I subscribe more to Schmitt's philosophy on this of what politics truly is than maybe you do, in part because I've always been more of a confrontational person. I've always applied that confrontational approach to politics that we know, believe it or not, some conservative organizations, like Fackel's a good example, teaches.
Yeah.
I've always just been more in line with that. And ever since I've read his work on that, it's pieced together stuff that I already knew. Yeah. I knew that we weren't going to vote our way out of this a long time ago. And
so I get that. Like, you're telling me all the.
Yeah.
What I want to know
point is that conflict is inevitable. Conflict is inevitable to life itself.
Okay, but that's a totem. Like, what I'm looking more specifically for is when we say that there's going to be a conflict within the United States, how do you envision that taking place?
Like, are we already past the point of no return?
Yeah, there is going to be a big fight.
There is going to be a big fight.
The
question of course, yes, one vision will win. We live in two countries, right? We don't live in a country. The United States does not exist as a country. It's a free trade zone with freedom of movement of people who I do not belong in the same country with Merrick Garland, or Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom. We don't belong in the same country. We have nothing in common other than that we're both human and we speak English. Other than that, we have nothing in common. And so the United States exists on paper. It is a free trade zone with freedom of movement, but it's not a country because there's no unifying vision. There's no unifying philosophy, set of principles, underlying belief system. There's two competing belief systems, and one will win. The left has already made it clear that one will win because they have a totalizing worldview. They literally do not grant us the moral legitimacy to even exist. The left will tolerate, the type of right that the left will tolerate? They will tolerate the Mitt Romney, Chris Christie right.
Yeah.
They will tolerate the controlled opposition right. The right that won't do anything to halt the brake, to put the brakes on it, let alone reverse the train in any sort of way. They will tolerate a controlled opposition and nothing else. This is why the second that somebody like Donald Trump comes along, who, let's be honest, there's plenty of things that Trump pushes that are left-wing positions from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But and at least in a symbolic way, and in other ways as well. I'm not saying that he's a total lib on everything, but in some ways he disrupts that status quo. He's not content to simply just act like controlled opposition. He's boisterous. He pushes back. He punches back.
Yeah.
They want to destroy him, so much so that they're trying to kill him right now, and they're trying to throw him in prison. Twice now, there's been an attempted assassination against him. He's gotten multiple criminal charges thrown against him. They're trying to eradicate this man because they view him as a threat. And so, like, that is enough of an example of how they will not tolerate any sort of right that ever wants to push back. They will only tolerate the Mitt Romney types that will simply conserve that which they achieved 20 years ago.
Well, and it's important to understand, too, that and when Mitt Romney is the selection,
they'll still call him...
all of a sudden, he's a racist, bigoted, sexist threat to democracy. Like, there is no candidate that the right can run that is not a racist, sexist, bigoted thrit to democracy.
Oh, absolutely. I know in Virginia, they ran ads against Ed Gillespie.
Yeah.
Like,
by the way,
the
used to be a
mellow,
Democrat
he
many
was
years
so
ago.
Mellow,
They
had like, this guy in a truck is running over immigrants
with a Gadsden flag license plate.
And that's supposed to be
doesn't
Gillespie.
matter. So just understand, it doesn't matter who you are. Now, Mitt Romney still believes that, well, if I just sit down and have coffee with these people, they'll understand. And then the problem is the left is smart enough to sit down and have coffee with them.
Yeah, because that's all they need to do to win.
Yeah.
They just need to have a conversation. And but when they talk to somebody like me, it's, no, you must be destroyed.
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to tolerate any
So what does that look like? What do you see? We've kind of talked about conditions catalyst before. Do you actually see one side winning in this, or do you see a split?
Oh, one side will win.
Or do you see a split?
No, and here's the reason why. I wrote a few notes on my phone before this podcast
Yeah.
because I wanted to make sure that I would get this across.
Okay.
This isn't a tweet.
Just say it.
All right. Here's what I said. Here's what I wrote down for myself. We have 3 options: surrender, separation, and subjugation. Surrender's out of the question because that's the Mitt Romney option.
Yeah.
We know that separation is impossible, and here's the reason why. Because the left has a totalizing worldview. They don't tolerate any dissent.
Yeah.
If we want to separate, you know what they will say? The trans kids of Mississippi must be liberated.
Yeah.
They will not tolerate separation.
Yeah.
That leaves us with only one option left. And it's an option that many people on the right are going to be uncomfortable with, but it's one that I'm not uncomfortable with. And that's subjugation. That's
All right.
absolute victory.
So here we go. So I'm going to stop you right there because our last part of this conversation is going to be, so what does victory look like, right? What does victory look like? We've talked about how to stem the tide. We've talked about how to fight back. Christian's opinion is we are so far gone that there will be a significant conflict. There will be a violent component to that conflict.
No, not guaranteed, believe it or not.
Not guaranteed. Okay, so Christian isn't necessarily guaranteed.
It will be a significant conflict, though.
But it will be a significant conflict, and you believe that it is absolutely incumbent on the right recognizing that they're going to have to wield a lot more government power against the left, not just...
No, a lot more power.
Oh.
Not just power in general.
Okay.
Okay. Outside, within government, power in general. The right needs to be comfortable with wielding power in order to defend that which we love.
So like ostracizing the left, making it impossible for them to do
Cancel
business,
culture.
cancel
Yes,
culture.
all of this stuff.
Okay.
I have to disagree. Like,
All right,
I'm
so
going to
Tina.
say I disagree on a point. Is you were hesitant to say that there would be blood, basically. You're hesitant to have a violent component, but you also said it would be subjugation. I submit to you, it's impossible to do one without the other. Anyway, but my thought is this.
Yeah.
We are past the point of no return, but it's going to take a catalyst to do it. For instance, I do think that we would have gotten there much quicker if Trump hadn't turned his head. I think that could have been a catalyst. I think that if they are ever successful with any of these attempts on his life, I think that would be a catalyst to make everything snap. Here's the thing. I think it will be very bloody. It will be very violent, and the left will be the first ones putting our heads on pikes. That is where they are. They're a cult, a death cult at this point. Everything they do is about undoing life, undoing anything natural. And so we are so diametrically opposed that all of these different institutions, some will dissolve completely and new things will pop up in their place, and some we will end up just pulling ourselves completely out of the sphere. And the more we do that, the more we self-sort, the more you're going to see the battle lines drawn. And the problem with this is it's not geographical. You can't just draw a line down the center of the United States and be like, you're here and we're here. No, and that is why it will be bloody. And that is why it will be ugly. It will be awful. And I do think we're past the point of no return on it, but I don't necessarily think it's tomorrow.
Do you think we separate, or do you think one side wins?
Okay, so I think I'm not sure there is any way to separate. And I'm not sure, I think it will be a long, drawn out, bloody, very ugly thing, and you're going to have a lot of people defecting and trying to stop it. And I don't think this is a cut and dry, clean situation. In fact, I don't think this is something we should be wishing for at all, because I think it's going to be horrible. But I don't see a way around it at this point. I mean, if I were just to say what I would love to have happen is for us to be able to just draw a line and go, you stay here and we'll stay here. But I don't believe that can happen. And so I don't think, I disagree that this can happen without a lot of horrific stuff happening, and I don't wish for it, but I do think that we will be there.
See, that's an interesting area of strong disagreement between the two of us, because I would ask, like,
I don't think you can have
how much-
subjugation without death.
really, because the left has subjugated us, and how much blood did they shed to get to this
I
point?
guess you have a different view of what subjugation is.
Maybe, but
Well, I'll say I want to address something that comes up in the comments. People have asked, like, why am I getting Kamala Harris ads? Is Nick getting this money? Can I tell you right now, we have no say on what ads YouTube plays in our videos. The only ads we have say over is the ads that we run within our, which is when I say True Classic T-shirts or Good Ranchers. Like, those are the only ads we have control over. You know, Kamala runs them and YouTube places them where they tell her to. So we get nothing from that.
Let
I
her waste her
promise you.
money on our audience.
Yeah,
That's
right?
fine.
Yeah. I'm actually good. Click on all her stuff through our stuff. That way she wastes
it's actually a good thing that they're doing that,
Yeah.
because they're wasting money on our audience.
Yeah,
We're obviously not
absolutely.
going to be voting for.
Absolutely. All right. So this goes to me. Do I think conflict is inevitable? And typically when I say conflict, I'm meaning more of the physical variety. Like, do I think it's a point? We've talked a lot about conditions or catalysts. There's a lot of people in the comments that I think made a good point, and that is when you, this is the point Christian has always made too, when you have a sovereign debt crisis, it all goes to crap, right? Because when all of a sudden you can't pay the troops and you can't pay the cops, and you know your money's not worth anything, you can't buy bread, people get violent real quick. Hunger is a huge catalyst. Now, I do believe the United States system is a little bit stronger than that. I think it's a little bit harder to pull off, although our politicians have certainly done everything within their power to do so. Here's what I'm going to say. I think the problem at this point right now is that I do think I don't see a way out of this without some sort of significant clash. I don't see any way out of it without a significant constitutional crisis. And to some degree, it depends on who's in power when the crisis happens. So, for instance, if the right is in power and the left institutes the crisis, I actually think that we could probably get through it with putting down some riots and maybe making some significant institutional changes, because the reason why the left sees Donald Trump as such a threat is because he recognizes the threat that the bureaucracy poses. And he's probably the first president in my lifetime that not only recognized that, but was actually willing to take significant measures in order to reduce their power. And no president has done that since Calvin Coolidge. That's over 100 years ago. So I think it's important to understand that, or it's 100 years ago. That's important to understand, is that's why Donald Trump is seen as such an incredible threat right now, is because he challenges what has been kind of the post-World War II global order. And we can have a whole other podcast talking about why that global order exists, what are the positives of it, what are the negatives of it. But he challenges that status quo. He doesn't automatically believe that NATO is an absolute necessity to world peace. He doesn't absolutely believe that our presence in the United Nations is just absolutely important.
He believes in borders.
He believes in strong national sovereignty. He believes in a lot of things that were actually seen as pretty regular standard-of-the-mill beliefs for most of human history. And then there was this strange period of time after World War II where we learned some good lessons from World War II, but we also learned, I would argue, some bad ones.
The 20th century was just a
crazy
disaster.
Yeah, and so it's
disaster.
important to understand. So it's important to understand that that's why I think they see him as a major threat. But if he's in charge and they force a crisis, I actually see that as being the least bloody and confrontational way out of this, provided that, and this is the part that is starting to view, the right is going to need to understand that Donald Trump is not their savior. Donald Trump can certainly be a leader for which they kind of rally around, but if he's the only one, you're screwed. He can't be the only one. You have to have governors, you have to have other people in positions of legitimate authority, and governors end up playing that role very nicely. You also have other elected representatives that do so. You might also have intellectual leaders that can play that role as well, cultural leaders that can play that role as well. But the right needs to start organizing a vision of what happens, not just opposition to the left. They actually have to have somewhat of a unified vision of this is what we want. And then they need to do a pretty good job of identifying who are the key leaders behind that vision. And again, if it's all just Trump's going to fix it because he's Trump, no, that will not work.
That was the 2016 mindset of a lot of people.
That will
Well,
not.
that's the mindset of a lot of people.
I need to finish this.
Okay.
That will not work. So you need to have governors. You need to have a bench of other leaders that you feel that you can trust. I think Ron DeSantis falls into that camp. I am increasingly encouraged by J.D. Vance, even though I have some disagreements with him. But I'm increasingly encouraged by J.D. Vance within that camp.
Can I point out one thing that's kind of interesting?
Yeah.
J.D. Vance went to Yale.
Yeah.
He read the concept of the political.
Yeah.
He's read Schmidt before.
Yeah. Was a law student.
He understands. Yeah. He understands. Like he's not going on the campaign trail name dropping this stuff because we know the media will immediately crucify him, but he understands the problem.
Yeah, so if the right is in control, I think we could actually find, provided that the right understands that there needs to be a bench, there needs to be a section of leaders, not just one leader that you put everything's dependent upon. Because that's part of what the left thinks right now. If they kill Trump, we're leaderless. Because nobody falls
as if
into
all
that
of these
position.
grievances will disappear if they remove Trump from the picture.
So now, if the left's in charge and they force the constitutional crisis, that's where I think it's far more likely to get bloody the way Tina described. Because I believe the left has worked for a couple of decades now, especially. It's actually been longer than that, but it's been a decade or two where it's worked its way into the mainstream, which is to say that now to be on the left is to believe that the right is evil. It used to be that to be on the left meant that you thought you were more compassionate and the right was just a little bit too obsessed with money. Now it's to be on the left in many cases means you think the right is evil. And so you have provided a firm moral justification for utilizing violence to achieve your end states. Because wouldn't you go back and kill Hitler if you could, right? Like this is the problem that we're seeing. And not only that, but the coping mechanism that the left is engaged in as people try to assassinate Trump. It's like, well, he brought this on himself. If Trump would just stop saying things the left doesn't...
He's a threat to democracy.
If Trump would just stop saying things the left doesn't like, we'd stop trying to kill him. Doesn't he understand that? Like, that's the amount of cope that's going on right now. Like, well, she really shouldn't have worn that dress in there. Like, that's the sort of...
Exactly.
That's the sort of...
Victim blaming.
That's the sort of argumentation that they're more than happy to use at this point. And that's where you kind of show this moral justification is reaching a level of completion that can justify violence. It's another reason why they continually say whenever you say, hey, look, I don't think transgenderism is a thing in the sense that I don't think you'd actually be. Well, now you're not just guilty of opposing what they believe. You're guilty of transgenocide. Mm-hmm. What do you do to people that commit acts of genocide? You kill them. You imprison them. You take their money away. You don't give them a platform. You censor them. Right? They are creating the moral justification to justify violence against their political enemies. Not in response to physical violence, but by categorizing everything they don't like as violence.
Though transgenocide just by definition is impossible.
Yeah, well, so here's the other thing that I want to get to on that. So that's where I think is important to understand is that, yes, conflict is inevitable. I believe that. If the conflict reaches a crisis point where it has to be dealt with, and the right's in charge, I actually see a pathway that is far more peaceful and stable. If the left's in charge, I see one that's far more violent and divisive. And it goes back to your point, Christian, is that I just don't think that they're willing to. Again, the trans kids of Mississippi must be liberated, right? They're always going to believe that they are on a moral crusade to justify this. So I know my answer was not as definitive one direction or the other. But I do again.
How convenient
for you. Well, because too many people
pick a side, Nick. I already told you what I think of people that won't pick sides.
Because of no, I picked the side. My side is the right. I just hope that there's a peaceful way to achieve victory. Now, this leads us to our last point. Let's say that the worst possible outcome takes place. And what we actually see is massive, widespread conflict. And to Tina's point, you're not going to see it as clearly defined as it was before with respect to, well, this state versus that state, because you have this urban-rural divide. But we are starting to see much more geographical self-sorting based off of ideological lines. You see people that say, I'm escaping the madness of this in order to go over here. And you will see that the people, people from Tennessee will sometimes say, I don't want Californians moving anymore. And what I would tell them is, the Californians moving into Nashville, you're right. You probably don't want them. The Californians moving into the rural parts of Tennessee are probably going to be some of the most, stalwart defenders of Tennessee that you've ever met in your life, because they appreciate where they've come to, and they want to help you defend it because they've seen what happens when it isn't defended.
My cousin Roman, shout out Roman if you're ever watching this. I know that my Aunt Marina is probably going to watch this, who's his mother. My cousin Roman works in Silicon Valley. He works for NVIDIA. And he's looking to move out of California, and he's looking at Eastern Tennessee right now.
Yeah.
He called me the other day, and he's like, Christian, I just want to find a place where I can go buy a gun, step out onto my porch at 2 a.m. and fire it into the air, and nobody does anything. Yeah. and so it's
that is either rural America or Washington D.C.
Yeah.
Or Detroit
or Chicago, right?
Yeah, or Chicago.
Yeah. But I mean, it's to your point that people are self-sorting, right? And I wouldn't say that Roman is like a hardcore right-wing person, but he's lived in the
clown world.
Yeah, in clown world, and he wants to get out of it. He wants to escape it. So, and I sympathize with that. The good news is that I mean, if there is any good news in all of this, because we're talking about some pretty deep stuff, like the good news is that we're almost at the point now where that self-sorting has gotten to its logical conclusion, right? Where you have parts of America that are just fundamentally different from each other. The problem is that you don't have really red states and blue states. You have blue cities and increasingly blue suburbs. And this is part of the reason, but not all. That's the geographic component of why I said separation is not possible. I wish it were, but it's not possible because leftism and, dare I say it, liberalism are totalizing worldviews. They're ideologies that must spread everywhere. They're universal. Yeah. In fact, Schmidt actually talks about this in his writings. He says that, liberalism conquers aristocracy and monarchy, but that was a long time ago. Even in his day, that was a long time ago. And this is before World War II. But we now know from the last 90 years since he wrote that book that liberalism also defeated fascism and communism, first in World War II and then in the Cold War. Mm-hmm. The problem is that egalitarian component that is Marxism has now infiltrated into liberalism itself, and so liberalism is no longer the one that you were espousing earlier. Yeah. It's now this modern social progressive leftist culturally Marxist hedonistic type of liberalism that still has this totalizing worldview where it doesn't tolerate any other. It doesn't tolerate dissent in part because it views itself as liberating. It views itself as pushing freedom. And it's really funny that, we're the forces of freedom and liberation, but you're never allowed to have any other view other than the one that we have, the regime-approved view. And so, like, if the right in the United States, or anywhere else for that matter around the world or in the West, wanted to break itself away from the left and say, you do you, but please leave us alone. Again, it's the side that wants to win will always defeat the side that wants to be left alone. On an individual basis, if you try to move to Idaho and just mine Bitcoin and hoard gold and be a homesteader, you will get Ruby Ridged. Yeah. Well, on a societal basis, the same exact thing would happen. If all the conservatives moved to the South or the West or the Midwest, and we had a clear-cut geographical divide, even more so than what we're currently at, and they said, we want to form our own nation state, self-determination. Isn't that a liberal principle? Yeah. They would say no, because the trans kids of Mississippi must be liberated.
Well, but this is the part where it goes into what sets up, if you're going to have a conflict, what sets you up in the best position to be able to successfully negotiate that conflict.
And the thing that
geographical self-sorting does.
That's one component, but the other thing, and this gets into like, how do we win? Yeah. Right? Or what happens if we win, the process, and then what do we do? This is actually why we need people like Trump to be elected, because we do not want to be in a position where the crisis happens and we're not the ones in charge. Yeah. For a variety of reasons. One, it reduces our likelihood of success. Yeah. Two, it makes it far more likely that it's going to be far more violent and chaotic and bloody than anybody would ever want. And three, if we're the ones in charge, guess what? It's a bit of irony, but the left has already forged the weapons that can be used against them, that can be turned against them.
Sure.
Because the left, and it's something that we have fought against for longer than I've even been alive, but my entire career in politics, your entire career in politics, we've been warning against the consolidation of power in Washington, D.C. Well, if we have the White House, and if we actually execute the type of vision that we need to be executing, which is we actually put our people in key positions, and then we dismantle other things that can't serve us any sort of purpose whatsoever, then at that point, we can actually force in that type of change that's badly needed, and we can mitigate the crisis that we know is coming. Because we'll be using the levers of power that the left has forged, that for so long we said you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be consolidating all this power in the executive branch. You shouldn't be consolidating all this power in the hands of Washington, D.C. Well, if we're in charge, even for a brief amount of time, as long as we have the stomach to do what needs to be done and the courage to do it, and we're unapologetic about it, we can do this with, actually, I think pretty quickly. We could do it in 4 years. But if we're out of power,
Yeah.
then everything changes.
Yeah. No, I think it gets much worse if we're not. And people might look at that and say, well, that sounds horribly convenient. But it's, okay, well, again, do you if there is going to be a crisis point, would you like the people that have fully embraced the friend-enemy distinction and have laid the moral framework for using violence against people that just happen to disagree with them? Or would you like the people in charge that have not fully adopted that to the extent of wanting to justify violence against people that I happen to disagree with? I am fine living in a world where if you want to be a full-blown communist, you have the right to be able to buy property, set up, businesses or industries, and then own them collectively and do all that. You're fine to do that. You just can't compel anyone else to do it. The problem is I've learned that those people never want to be able to extend that same courtesy of self-determination and freedom of choice to anybody that they disagree with. It's never good enough for them to have the right to do what they want to do. They must force you to either join or subsidize. And since I will not be forced to do so, they're the ones pushing toward a conflict. Now, the problem is their foot soldiers at this point are made up of people that fall into a little puddle of emotional mush the moment you misgender their dog. So I don't think that's exactly the vanguard of the proletariat they're looking for, but it is what it is. Okay, last part. This is going to be the fun part. So we have a huge conflict, and one side wins. And as we look over the ash, we see a flag. We see a flag firmly planted, and it is the kingdom of Christian. That's right. His Majesty, Christian Hines, second of his name, keeper of the scrolls, God save the king. Christian is now king of the American kingdom. What sort of changes do you make to the system in order to foster a more perfect union while preventing some of the things that led to this horrible civil war that we have now emerged with Christian, our leader and sovereign?
Nick is outing me as a closet monarchist, which I basically am at this point. I'm going to be honest. It's why my profile picture on Twitter is the Austro-Hungarian chibi. But, Nate was asking us before we recorded, you have no links, right? And I was like, yeah, we have no links. And I have like 10 links up. The reason why is because I actually answered this question after we did our debate.
Okay.
So we did our debate, and there was this thing at the very end there.
Yeah, where Tina made
set
you
me
mad.
off. And there were a lot of people that wanted, a little bit more elaboration because it was mostly passion, right? It wasn't me thinking out stuff. So I sat down after we had that discussion, and then I had some other conversations with a few other people in the community, like Andrea, some of our Minecraft folks. And I was able to articulate a little bit more of what it was that I was trying to get across. So if you permit me to actually read what I wrote, I think I can answer the question.
You're the sovereign. I am bound by divine.
All right, I'm making the exception.
By your divine right to read off.
I'm going to read off. I don't have it on screen, unfortunately, because I was an idiot.
The Magna Carta of the Kingdom of Christian.
So here's what I wrote on Twitter to answer the question from the debate.
Going to bring out on Twitter.
I know. Hey, it's not being shown on screen though.
All right, just do it. Just do it.
So here's what I said. I said, I got a lot of messages from people who said that they agreed with several of the points I made in my recent debate with Nick, but wished that I'd done more to articulate the specifics of what I was advocating for. I'll elaborate on what I jokingly referred to as Christian Stan in the post. Here's the first question. Let's start with the big question. What do I mean by monarchy? I brought this up in the debate, and I said, I mean an executive that has real power to govern a nation, rather than simply be a figurehead for the bureaucratic state to impose a particular ideological agenda on anyone as a means to keep leftists in power. We have a figurehead president at the moment. No one honestly thinks Joe Biden is running anything. Real power lies in our fourth branch of government, a monolithic bureaucracy run by the managerial class. The president is powerless to do anything unless the bureaucracy agrees with him. If they don't, they can simply wait him out of office. Presidents and Congresses come and go. The Leviathan is eternal. The left understands this, which is why it constantly has to invent one new grievance after another to remain in power. It's the ideological equivalent of a self-licking ice cream cone. A monarchy has no such need for things because power is invested in a sovereign. There never needs to be a fake moral crusade of protect trans kids or the new current thing, trademarked, to justify voting blue no matter who, because the sovereign answers to the divine rather than the Leviathan or its NPCs. Here's the next question. But Christian, monarchies have problems too. How do you solve that? Of course they do. I've mentioned this in previous tweets. They essentially destroyed themselves 110 years ago during World War I, and here we are a century later still paying the price for this disaster. But there's a few points that we must consider. And the first is actually a quote by an anti-French revolutionary. He was a counter-revolutionary during the French Revolution, Antoine Rivière, and he said, "The absolute ruler may be a Nero, but he is sometimes a Titus or a Marcus Aurelius. The people are often Nero, but they are never Marcus Aurelius." Now, I'm not even advocating for an absolute ruler, but I'm taking this framework to say we need a strong sovereign, we need a strong executive in order to mitigate the power of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, the Leviathan, has replaced the sovereign that we supposedly got rid of. And now we're living under the total state that Schmidt warned about. We're living under, dare I say it, a form of anarcho-tyranny. I continue with this. Don't worry, I'm almost done. Sorry, I got to pull it up again. So I continue with it, and I said, there's a few points that we must consider. One, we accept that we're dealing with the possible. We're not dealing with the utopian. There is no perfect system, and if you're a Christian, you should understand that. Two, when we look at the track record of managerial oligarchies, such as the one we're currently living under, and compare it to the historical monarchies found in France or Germany, there's no question that the latter is far more preferable. No one in the Ancien regime was chopping kids' genitals off in the furtherance of an ideology oriented towards the acquisition of political power. No one in the Holy Roman Empire was inventing a new current thing every 5 minutes to gaslight the public into voting blue, no matter who. Nick, you brought up in our debate, well, how much of that was because of technology or willpower? And I pointed out what great technological leap occurred between 1788 and 1793. Louis XVI had a fraction of the amount of power that the Jacobins ruthlessly wielded to an ideological end state in order to purify the country and make people virtuous. And they ended up murdering hundreds of thousands of their own people. No king in France's history ever came even close to the amount of tyrannical power and evil application of an ideology that the French revolutionaries brought about just a few years later. Here's the next point that I bring up. There is no guaranteed way to avoid every imaginable calamity. There are simply ways to incentivize good and bad outcomes. This is actually a point that Thomas Sowell brings up when he says that you should not be leaving power in the hands of those who pay no price for being wrong. I continue and say, what we have right now is a system that incentivizes the wholesale destruction of civilization at the hands of the aristocracy of clown world. Why? Because the left can retain power only by dissolving the social and political bonds that hold society together. The answer to this crisis is to stop incentivizing the sacrifice of civilization upon the altar of tolerance. You can do this in two ways. One, you can incentivize good outcomes by placing decision-making powers in the hands of those who stand to lose from bad outcomes. This can be done through a variety of means, such as providing military service, being net taxpayers, getting married and having kids who will one day be the next generation to live and govern the nation that they're growing up in. And two, you can disincentivize bad outcomes by denying decision-making powers to those who are too delusional, too mentally ill, or too ideologically possessed by oikophobia to understand the consequences of the policies they support. And then I conclude with saying there is ultimately only one way that you put an end to the left's civilization-destroying excesses. You tell them no, and you deny them any mechanism to obtain power. Does that answer the question?
There you go. I think so. We think of it. We each get one question for him. My question is this: as you are the sovereign, who will succeed you, and what is the process for selecting who succeeds you?
So this is why I think that monarchy is preferable to dictatorship as a way to actually bring about the type of world that I want to see. And the type of world that I want to see is one that we've articulated on this podcast before. I still believe in the Austrian school. I still believe in free markets. I still believe in property rights. I still believe in individual liberty. But I've seen the type of society that we live in now, the total state that we're living in now, and I realize that the democratic system that we have right now is facilitating this. Left-wing progressive liberalism is facilitating this. And so you have one of two paths that you can take. If you've rejected liberalism and you're on the right, you can go in a tyrannical dictatorial path, Or you can go in the old school right path, the old school illiberal right path, which is monarchy. The dictatorial path, we saw this happen in like Chile and Spain. Well, great. You've thrown all the commies out of power, right? You've brought in the, dictatorship of the right wing.
Okay, real quick, I'm going to stop you because we got to move on to other
I
ones.
know.
How
Point
do you
is that
who succeeds you, and what's the process for doing so?
You don't have legitimacy when you just have a dictatorship. So when I say monarchy, I mean that ultimately I think that it's something similar to what the founders originally came up with.
Hamilton came up with.
Hamilton came up with. It's an electoral system. It could be similar to like the HRE where they elected the emperor, right? It could be an electoral system, but I think that you need a very strong sovereign. You need a very strong executive. Maybe I should say executive because we're in the United States. I think you need a very strong executive that is secure in their power. But in order for you to have succession, it shouldn't just be we won the Civil War and now we have a dictatorship. You need to have legitimacy tied into that. And I think that having something similar to what the founders originally intended, where you had an electoral college that elected an executive, but I want an executive that has real executive authority, not the figurehead president that we have right now in the form of Joe Biden. And Hamilton was wrong about the bank, but I think he was right about some of these other things. And potentially maybe for life, maybe you still have term limits for the president or whatever you call them. But the point is that we need an executive that is secure in their power and that doesn't need to construct a bureaucracy and doesn't need to come up with a bunch of left-wing social fads in order to justify retaining power. Because ultimately, I think the right has this mistake that they think that power is the ring of Sauron and that there's some sort of Mount Doom that you can throw it in. There's not. You can't get rid of it. The ring exists. The question is not how do you destroy the ring. The question should be how do we find the most virtuous person to bear power, to wield power in order to defend that which we love. I think that that's the mechanism that we need to go about in order to achieve that.
All righty. So there you go. That is one of these systems of government you could choose to live in the audience. The audience can now vote on this later. Next, we will move over to our supreme military dictator. That's right. Generalissimo Tina, Queen of the Bees, scourge of Planned Parenthood, and our now sovereign who rules by divine right and military power. Tina, explain exactly how your dictatorship works.
Well, this exercise is a little hard for me because I'm still of the opinion that our Constitution, the way it was set up, without a few of the amendments I would get rid of. But I still think it's the best form of government we've seen. And I like the idea of freedom. But I do think that we definitely should never have shut down the mental institutions, and now they are running the asylum, right? I mean, they're running things now. I think that I think that it's way too messy to think that, this is all going to be over and now you rule the world or rule the country. This is a problem way beyond our borders. This is a problem across the entire world. And I believe that, from my biblical worldview, I know it's only going to get worse. And I know that you cannot force people to want all the same things. It doesn't work. You're giving it the kiss of death the minute you take away freedoms across the board. So I would, if I found myself in power after this absolute bloodbath that would ensue, and I assume that we would probably break up into various factions, various states and things like that, but just for the sake of argument, let's say we all remained one solid unit. I would want to start over again with our U.S. Constitution minus the income tax. And I would also redo how we basically go back to the way they intended the voting to work and the separation of powers and all of that. I would, because I think that that's one of the areas where the system got it was the poison pill, right? When senators became elected by popular vote, that was one of the kisses of death. And also the income tax. That would need to go away. So I would want a very minimal federal government, and I would want the states to take on more of the responsibility. And tax-wise, if any type of income tax was ever to be levied, or any type of tax, period, the states would need to agree to send their taxes for their state to the federal government if that's what they so choose. If there's any type of tax like that.
Why would they ever choose to do that, though?
Well, then I guess we won't have a tax. See, that's how it works. I don't believe the federal government should have any power to tax the people. Period. The end. It should have power to tax the states that have signed on to be part of that to be part of the system. So the state.
This is the lamest military dictatorship ever.
The state would tax the people what they felt was the correct amount of tax, and then they would pay the federal government for the federal services that were provided by the federal government, and it would not be a tax. They would be paying for services, and that's how I see that. I just don't see a better system than what we have. I'm very invested in this. I don't want to see.
I'm upset.
I know that was so lackluster. Everyone wanted Tina to be spicy, but
I wanted Tina to be Tina. I wanted Tina to go full Tina.
Well, I mean, I would love to send out a census.
You are no Genghis Khan. I was
waiting for her to say that at some point the helicopter fuel pays for itself.
Right. I'm like, you know what? I knew Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a friend of mine, and you are no Genghis Khan.
I think that it would kind of behoove us, though, to send out some type of census where people need to say where they stand on issues, and just basically a questionnaire like, how can we better serve you? Where do you align on this and this and this? And then after that, we use that to go and take the people that don't align with us and move them to like Australia or whatever. Like how
there we go. There's the Genghis Khan.
You know how Britain decided they were going to send all their criminals to Australia. Well, that's what we'll do.
Dude,
we'll just everybody who answered the questionnaire wrong, we will just send them somewhere else where they can do their own government.
I love it. This is actually how a lot of the conversations go on
That's
this podcast.
better than me saying we would do a purge.
It usually starts off with Tina going, I really love our system, government, and country, and the whole deal. If I was in charge, I would change this with the tax system. And then, of course, there would be a questionnaire that would determine whether or not you go to the penal colony.
Well, you wouldn't tell them that at first. You would just say, how can we better serve you? Show us where you align on this.
Gosh.
How can we better serve you?
You could be doing poetry from the Alaskan gulags, right?
Yeah. You can write slam poetry for the state. Oh my gosh. Okay.
No, we would not send
this is,
malevolent llama. We would not send them to Canada. It's too close. We cannot secure that border. It will have to be an island somewhere.
All right. So you have the Kingdom of Christian. You have the apparently kind of quasi-benevolent military dictatorship of Tina. And then finally, we will go to myself, Nicus Jasonius Irakis of the House Freitas, first consul of the Republic.
Always the idealist, wanting to save. All right.
I am still insisting on the Republic. But there would be some rules changes. First of all, I do believe in a federated system, so I do believe that your local regional authorities, call them states, call them provinces, whatever you want, they would have certain jurisdiction in order to make decisions, especially those which are closer to kind of the social norms within a particular area. So I would respect regional, social, cultural differentiations within those areas and allow for a certain degree of self-determination. This is going to sound a whole lot like what our founders originally established, minus the slavery part. But the federal government would be exclusively responsible for defense of the realm, defense of the Republic. When it came to domestic tranquility, there would be a very, very limited role there that would largely be dealt with by the states. There would be one national sales tax. It would be a fixed rate, and that sales tax would be across the entire Republic. and that would be the entire operating budget of the federal system. This would pay for the Army, and it would be constitutionally mandated to never go above a 1%. So it's a 1% sales tax with respect to purchases. That feeds the federal government, which is responsible for essentially two things. It's responsible for protecting the republic, the enforcement of certain civil liberties, which would be required of all areas of the realm, and it would be responsible for certain infrastructure that would be necessary in order to facilitate the protection of the realm. When it came to suffrage would actually be rooted in a couple of concepts. It would be rooted with respect to your obligations. So essentially, if you can be drafted, you will get the right of suffrage. Or if you are, obviously with the sales tax, everyone is essentially a net taxpayer. The other thing that would need to be understood is that there would be no federal welfare or other support, economic support for citizens. Zero. None of it. It is not the responsibility of the government. It would not be done. And you would not be able to, one state would not be able to rely on the federal government in order to bail them out of their own decisions. We would allow at the state or provincial level for you to make, again, not enumerated at the state level. You can make certain decisions as long as you're not violating federally protected civil liberties. But insofar as you fail, and you will bear the consequences of it. Charity is still obviously welcome to exist, but there is no federal subsidization of education. There's no federal subsidization of business or industry. There's no federal subsidization. Currency is gold-backed or gold or silver, I don't care, but it's some sort of precious commodity, which allows for, again, the minting of coins, which can facilitate commerce within the republic. But the central federal authority has no ability. There's a mathematical equation with respect to the actual the coinage. This would obviously translate into paper currency as well, but there is no such thing as a fiat currency. It has to be backed by a commodity, and the federal government, insofar as it creates that. Now, we would also perfectly allow for competing currencies. There's only that one, and that is essentially necessary for the collection of taxation, but that's it. So that would be the Republican realm. There would be a very hands-off with respect to provincial governing and authority, except for the protection of certain inherent civil liberties, which must be guaranteed throughout the entire republic, but absolutely zero federal subsidization of any of the various things that, like our own federal government does. That it no longer exists. There's no more federal warfare. There's no more welfare. None of it. The federal government is focused exclusively on protecting the realm and securing the constitutionally protected rights of all citizens within the realm, and then your local provinces can make up various arrangements as they see fit. And then again, suffrage is dependent upon whether or not you are actually you are actually either a net taxpayer, but you have to be somewhat invested. Now, again, one of the reasons why I say absolutely no federal welfare at all is because I will not allow for a situation where anybody, and this is something that would apply to the states as well, nobody can be a net beneficiary of the tax system without actually contributing. So you can't be a net beneficiary. You can invest into it, but you cannot be in a position where you're able to vote for yourself privileges from the Treasury at the expense of other people. You have to be a net contributor.
Somebody in the chat said, did he just say Tina couldn't vote?
No,
is that what you're saying, honey? Since I can't be drafted?
No, and this you again, it's the net taxpayer, so you have to be a net contributor, right?
Uh-huh.
Or you have to be capable of being drafted for the protection of the state. So if we can bring you to war, you get to vote. If you're a net taxpayer and contributor, you can vote. But again, what you cannot do is vote for yourself privileges from the Treasury in disproportion to your actual contribution.
You know what would be a cool idea? I'm just now thinking of this.
Wait 1 second.
So it might not be a good idea. But I was saying, what if you had as many votes as are in your household? So we have, let's say when all our kids were home and they were under 18, so they weren't voting age yet, what if we got all of the votes they will inherit? So when they turn 18, those votes get handed over to the kids, but we get to use those votes until then. And that encourages people to stop killing their children.
No, I think I'm good. Yeah, no, somebody asked, what do I think about the idea of conscription-based suffrage? So that was kind of popularized in the book Starship Troopers. And it was interesting because in the world that he wrote in Starship Troopers, the only people that could hold public office or vote were people that had actually served in the military.
You had to serve in the military to be a citizen.
Yes, there was a difference between a citizen and a civilian. A civilian still got all the privileges of the benefits of the economy. There was still equal protection before the law. They could essentially appreciate all the benefits of being a citizen, with the exception of voting or holding public office. And the concept behind that is that you had to actually take on the personal responsibility for the security of the state in order to have a say in the way that the state was actually run. And honestly, if you look at, there's a lot of people that look at it like, oh, this was so horrible. Women didn't have the right to vote because men were just horrible, mean, and evil. Okay, if that's your rendition of that, but a lot of it is for most of human history, nobody had the right to vote. And the way the enfranchisement started was based off of that concept of if you could be sent off to war, then you could have some say with respect to the decisions that were being made, or the people that would make the decisions to send you to war. So that's not to say it was perfectly fine to reject the ability for women to vote. Like, I don't believe that. I believe women should have the right to vote, but I think it is an overly simplistic argument to say that this was just based off of misogyny or hatred toward women or desire to keep them down, when in reality, again, when you went from nobody had the vote to landed gentry had the vote because they were responsible for providing the fjords and the tax bases for military aspirations, to the people that actually fought in those units could have it, to eventually more of universal suffrage. Again, I just think it's important for people to understand that there's a distinction there. Okay, well, I think that was fun. You guys all get to choose. Where do you want to live in? Do you want to live in the kingdom of Christian? Do you want to live in the really lame military dictatorship of Queen of the Bees? I really thought it was going to be a little bit more. I mean, if you make it past the questionnaire, I guess you're good. You pretty much live in it. But if you don't, if you fill out that questionnaire wrong,
we got to weed them out somehow. And
penal colony, my
friend.
At
least I didn't say we would purge them. We'll just send them somewhere else.
Yeah, and then
and somebody said, "Oh, how about Cuba?" No, Cuba's too close. We're going to annex Cuba, actually, and we will also annex Mexico, and then we will and Canada. That's all going to be mine. And they better answer the questionnaire right.
Everybody's going to choose Nick because we live in a republic, and so
no, I don't think so. I think you'd be surprised at how many people would choose yours.
No, you're going to wait. The reason why is the United States was founded on liberal Enlightenment values. We're gonna cling to these things all the way until the end.
I want to address this. Renee said, as a female, if I willingly join the military, do I get to vote? Yeah, that was the whole point. Right? Like, that's what I said. And then it was, how do you feel? I'm also very interested to hear Nick's stance on taking care of injured veterans. I believe the government should, because again, so this is the difference between a welfare benefit and an entitlement based off of a transaction. Mm-hmm. The entitlement based off of a transaction is in order to entice people to serve in the military, there are certain things that they do. One of those enticements is cultural. It's the idea that serving your military is respected and considered noble and honorable within society. That's the cultural component. The economic component usually goes with the idea that we will pay you to serve because you're a volunteer force. In addition to paying you to serve, that we will also provide you other benefits. There's generally 3 benefits that are offered to veterans. One is the Montgomery GI, which is to say that we will pay for some degree of your education or pay back student loans that you might have had as a result of serving. Another is the idea of the veteran's home loan. Like, we will make it easier for a veteran to be able to get a home loan with 0% down. And then the other component has to do with your medical benefits. Now, I believe the medical benefits are actually the worst of the 3. And the reason why is because the first 2 are treated like a resource that is given to a veteran that they can go into the marketplace, and then people compete for that resource. The medical is the one that is exclusively run by the government in such a way to where now we're not treated like a customer, we're treated like a burden on an overtaxed system. And so it's not that the government doesn't have an obligation to live up to the obligation they made to that veteran when they served, which is to say that we will take care of you for injuries or wounds sustained in the commission of your duties. I think that's perfectly appropriate. I also think we've created a system where we perversely incentivize anybody that has served to get as much as they can out of the system, regardless of whether or not they were actually genuinely injured in such a way as to justify it. And that's a very unpopular opinion, but I've seen it happen. People ask me how much I have in disability. The answer is 0. And the reason why I've taken 0 in disability is because I didn't sustain any significant injuries. Now, are there things that I could definitely point to with respect to probably my knees or my back or my hearing? Yes. And there will be a day where I probably need hearing aids, probably sooner than other people, because I did 11 years active duty. All of that 11 years was in combat arms. I was infantry, I was a paratrooper, and then I was a Green Beret. And I went to combat twice. So yeah, there are things from jumping out of airplanes and everything else, injuries sustained, that I could justify and will when I need that. But my goal is not to milk the system for everything it's worth. My obligation that I see on my side, the honorable thing for me to do, is to utilize those benefits which are appropriate for service-related injuries. Not to try to get as much as I possibly can out of it, because there's still a finite amount of money. And I had friends that lost legs and then continued to serve. And so I think it's important that there's an honorable way to go about taking care of veterans. And then there's a dishonorable way about taking care of veterans, and certainly ignoring the injuries that took place as a result of everything from Agent Orange to maybe certain vaccines that were required to be taken. We shouldn't do that. We need to make amends for that. But that's what I think. And again, I don't believe that has, I don't believe any of what I just mentioned is contradictory with what I've said with respect to federal welfare. I think it's important to distinguish between welfare and what is genuinely an entitlement. An entitlement is I contribute, I get something. Anyways, hope that helps. Yeah, and some people always wonder if I'm not a federal legislator. I'm in the state house in Virginia. So
yeah, somebody was asking what you're doing for East Palestine, Ohio, and Nick has no ability to legislate anything in Ohio. He is in the state legislature in Virginia. He is not on the federal level. Even if he wanted to legislate something for Ohio, he could not.
Jeffersonian Anti-Federalist also says, by the way, is Circle an app? Yes, it's a web page. It's an app. If you go into Circle, that's actually where our online community is. We get a lot of ideas for the episodes that we do, and there's a lot of other stuff. And by the way, I'm not gonna spill the beans too much here, but within probably about a month or so, we got some big announcements coming out on some of the things that we're going to be doing within the Circle community going forward, because we're going to make that a lot more integrated into what we do. So that's,
since you're like sort of announcing things, have you told our followers yet that you have signed a book deal?
What?
Yeah. Nick signed a book deal.
Yeah, I did. I signed a book deal.
So be watching for that.
We'll see. That'll be coming out, I think, 2025-ish.
I need to hear more about this.
Yeah.
But okay, so I know that we're at the end of the podcast. I've got a final question. So we've talked about, like, what do we think is going to happen, how the friend-enemy distinction is going to play out.
Yeah.
What type of system we would advocate for. I need to get better at articulating what I'm saying, not use the word king and say, CEO or president, executive.
Yeah, executive.
Not sovereign, executive. Yeah, because otherwise I'm doing really bad marketing when I'm trying to speak to Americans, because I'm just going full continental philosophy here. But do you think that it's actually possible that any sort of combination of anything that we've talked about today can actually happen, right? Because we were talking about a hypothetical here at the end. Like, how likely do you think it is that we actually see a crisis moment reach where the friend-enemy distinction has been masked for so long, and as Schmidt kind of warns about in Concept of the Political, eventually it will reveal itself, even if liberalism tries to hide it for a long time. Like, how likely do you think this is? I think it's inevitable. And I think, you said earlier that you think it's inevitable, but like, when do you think this will happen? How far out do you think?
Oh, I actually think this next election could be a catalyst.
You think this election?
This election could be a catalyst, not for like a full-blown war, but I think what it is that right now, everyone, based off of just kind of traditional norms and whatnot, everyone just kind of expects that, things will get bad, things will get rocky, but then it'll reach an equilibrium and we'll kind of go back to a norm. And
we'll go back to the 90s.
Yeah, right. I think this election cycle is actually going to show one way or another some cracks in the system that will make it more evident to the people that are just so certain that it's not as bad as anyone's making it out to be. It's just social media and the algorithm convincing you that you're in your own little bubble and everything's really fine. I actually think this next election cycle, either way, is going to show that there's bigger cracks in the system, and I think it's going to start to become apparent to the section of the population that doesn't see them. to your point, the sovereign debt crisis is that's the ultimate
I
catalyst.
think that's
right?
the thing.
There's no getting through a sovereign debt crisis without people.
That's when we go
real wily,
full Zimbabwe, right? Or hopefully not full Weimar. But to use the Schmidt reference there, that would be a bad outcome.
Yeah.
Like,
I think what ends up happening right now is that if Trump wins, I think like Rudyard believes that if Trump wins, there's going to be massive riots in certain states.
Oh, he's right.
He thinks it'll go to the point where you have some states that will actually seriously consider, if not outright secession, some forms which kind of distinguish itself from the federal government in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. I think I think if Kamala wins, if Harris wins, I think there's going to be a lot of people on the right that just do not believe it was legitimate. And the real question will there be sufficient evidence? So I think last time the idea that you would challenge an election outcome was just so horrendous in the minds of the vast majority of Americans that to even do so would require such overwhelming evidence that it could not be. And it would require other organizations that still have social legitimacy to question it. You didn't have that, right? You had the Trump campaign questioning it. You had various conservative outlets that were questioning it. But you did not have, like on a massive level, like state institutions or other major institutions coming forward. Like if like a game changer would have been had the entire government or had you had a whistleblower inside some of these institutions going, no, I saw it, this is how they did it, and here's the evidence. That would have been a different story. You didn't have that, right? You had certain
there was
whistleblowers.
A little of that.
You clearly not sufficient enough to get everybody on board. The question is this time around, here's what's different. Last time, a lot of the laws were changed in special sessions in COVID. How do I know this? Because I sat in one and I voted against everything they were doing, and it didn't stop anything. And then even a judge came out of Virginia and said they didn't do it right, and it didn't stop anything, right? So we're now at a point, though, where you had such strange conditions around 2020 with COVID and the election going on at the same time and riots going on. There was so much going on to distract that I think a lot of people were not prepared for what took place. That will not be the case this time. I have sat in on meetings with a number of attorneys that are positioned and ready to go the moment anybody at a polling location goes, something's happening that's not right, that are ready to show up and start documenting everything that's taking place and demanding action. The amount of attorney generals that you have that are wary of it, the amount of registrars that you have that are wary of it, the amount of governors that you have are wary of it. It is going to be a different game. Now, what does that say about the blue states? Not much. So that's what's going to be interesting, is to watch what happens in places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. What is happening in places like Milwaukee? That's going to be, go look at your major urban areas within swing states that will ultimately decide the outcome of election. I guarantee you're going to have far more Republican legal representation up, ready to see what is going on, standing in the polls, being poll watchers, doing all of that. And that's going to be the part where it is going to be significantly more difficult to pull off any sort of like shady business than it was in 2020. And so that's going to be the point where if Harris wins and all of a sudden stuff is coming out, yes, I understand. If Harris wins and stuff is coming out, then I think you're going to have far more likely for states, governors to be like, I don't recognize this. And then you have a real constitutional crisis. What happens then? What happens when it's not just Trump saying I got ripped off and Trump supporters saying it got ripped off? What happens when you have governors of major states, attorney generals going forward going, we do not accept this outcome because we're conducting our own investigation because we have overwhelming evidence of fraud? That is a game changer, because now you have multiple levels of legitimacy. You don't have to rely on the word of maybe one or two people or institutions. You've got multiple institutions with cross-section legitimacy saying something's wrong.
I get that we're in a better position, like strategically, than we were 4 years ago. And forgive me for dragging this on just a little bit more, but I have to ask one final follow-up question. Yes,
you know that we're almost 15 minutes past our normal.
I know, but I think the audience will like this as a wrap up.
Our listeners.
Do you remember?
I'm kidding.
Do you? Tina hates our listeners. I like them. I just want everybody to know that. No, okay. So, Nick, you remember when the first assassination attempt took place back in July? There were immediately after that happened, like within a few minutes, there were people on the left that were saying things like, oh, I wish he hadn't missed.
Yeah.
Right? Saying terrible stuff.
Yeah.
And then there were some people that were being fired, right? Libs of TikTok was documenting like tweets from people. I think it was like Tenacious D had a member that said some really terrible stuff, and they pushed back hard on them. And there was this brief moment where it was like, whoa, the left are now imagining what would happen if the roles were reversed.
Yeah.
But you know what I also noticed? I noticed a lot of people on the right that were upset at the fact that people like Libs of TikTok were canceling left-wing people that were tweeting terrible stuff, rooting for the assassination. There was a huge chunk of the right that was pushing back against the right for holding these people accountable for what they said, that were upset about the cancel culture. And so to wrap this up, like, the pessimist in me thinks that the right has not fully realized the friend-enemy distinction. The right still thinks we can litigate this thing out through procedure, through elections, through democracy, through liberalism, and that, we shouldn't stoop to the left's level, right? There's these concepts like the woke right, there's the horseshoe metric, and I think these are all inappropriately applied, but there's elements of the right, there's conservatives that have this idea that any sort of retaliation against the left, any sort of application of the friend-enemy distinction against the left is somehow a betrayal of our own principles. Mm-hmm. I want to wrap us up here. I want your thoughts, and maybe we should do a whole podcast on this concept, right? But I want
not right now. So
yeah, but not right now. I want your thoughts on, like, do you think that's a hindrance to us getting to that crisis moment, that the right is not yet ready for this confrontation?
I think the right is more ready than they've ever been in my lifetime, and I think they're increasingly becoming more so. What I would tell the people that are on the fringes saying like, oh, well, we don't believe in cancel culture. Here's what needs to be understood about like the proper manifestation of cancel culture. This has become another one of those terms that is horribly defined, if not defined at all. It just becomes something bad that the other side is doing to you. There's a big difference between the government or major platforms kicking you off because while claiming to be something they're not. Like, we're just an objective platform. We're not a publisher. But then they deplatform you because the government doesn't like something you said. That's a form of canceling that actually has the backing of the state. And there's something to that is horribly wrong. When you kick Dr. Seuss out of all the public school libraries, that's canceling that has the backing of the state. When you choose not to do business with somebody because the way they're behaving, that's just called freedom of association. And starting to understand that, well, look, I might not agree with what they say, but, I'm going to still do business with them. Okay, you might be in a position where you have to. But if you're not, well, then understanding that you may actually be contributing to the very thing that you claim to oppose, especially if it's someone that is just rabidly leftist. Right? It's one thing to have the mom and pop store that you go buy milk at that you guys just don't agree on politics sometimes. It's something else when you have somebody that is so in your face about everything, and then you insist on, still maintaining those. No, at some point, canceling them is appropriate, because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm not going to help subsidize or support an organization, institution, or business which clearly hates me and will use those resources to actively engage in achieving outcomes which I believe to be contradictory to my desired outcomes. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. Not to mention the fact that, look, saying, well, what would imagine like if the roles were reversed, is not actually reversing the roles. People don't change their behavior by imagining the roles reversed. People tend to change their behavior when the roles get reversed. Right? I can tell you all day long, the stove is hot, don't touch it. You don't realize the stove is hot until you touch it. And so there is a point where we're going to have to look at this and be like, fine. Are there certain lines I don't think we should ever cross, because it is such a violation of our own principles that it is unconscionable? Sure. But I think there's other things where it's like, no, I want your business to be run into the ground. That is my official statement because of what you're doing. You could have shut up and just provided goods and services. You decided to wade into this fight, and therefore it's going to have consequences. I'm sorry, I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem when you use state power to do it. Mm-hmm. Okay, but by the same token, when you look at what DeSantis did in Florida, he didn't use special state power in order to punish Disney for doing it. He said, okay, Disney, you've got all these special things that you've gotten from the state, and now you want to override what the state has done with the power that we're giving you, in part through our subsidization of your actions. Okay, well, guess what? The state of Florida is no longer interested in subsidizing your actions. Bye-bye. Right? And if you don't like it, Go for it. That's perfectly appropriate. I do not see a problem with that. I do not see a problem with that. So I think that's we can do. I think the right can have a healthy discussion with respect to where the line is, but I think we need to start realizing that telling them, imagine if the roles were reversed, doesn't work. Reversing the roles in some cases might. And maybe we should have more of a discussion of where are those roles going to be reversed as opposed to just, fictional manifestations.
You heard them, folks. Vote early, vote often.
No.
I'm just kidding.
That is absolutely not what I said. I will never encourage.
We
voter
definitely should do a podcast at some point on that and the whole concept of the woke right and talking about that debate.
What is the appropriate use of power on the right in order to push back about what's going on? That would be a great episode, one to have for another time. But I'm going to finish this one up by saying this. A lot of the discussions that we have on here, because it's fun to watch the comments and people will kind of pick a side sometimes in a conversation that we're having. And that's great. That's what we want. We like to do sometimes what we call devil's advocate episodes, where we'll actually take an issue, and the whole purpose of it is to kind of step back away from it and start to just look at the ideas and the concepts that we're being discussed to try to figure out where there is merit, maybe where we disagree, and then how do we properly understand this to maybe explain things that we see going on. These last two episodes were a perfect example of this. Nobody at this table is a fan of Carl Schmitt. However, we do think some of the theories that he expressed and some of the things he talked about are important and relevant to what we see going on today, and to discuss what are those legitimate critiques of classical liberalism. What are maybe some of the other critiques that we don't think are legitimate? How do we use this to explain what's going on and maybe have a better understanding of what could potentially happen if we don't kind of wake up to what's going on around us? All of that is an important and legitimate conversation. What I hope you all know is that when we have these conversations, there's certain things that people at this table are absolutely dedicated to. We're absolutely dedicated to the idea of objective truth. We're absolutely dedicated to the idea of objective morality. Everyone at this table is ultimately a Christian. And so we do believe that there is, again, objective truth and morality, what we are subject to. And so the worldviews that you hear always come from that perspective. But we do also like to be able to take ideas and look at them from multiple perspectives to see if we can get a clearer view of what is actually going on so that we can achieve the end results that we would like to have. So as we get into some of these, more of these topics, and there's a lot we've discussed lately about how would we have some of these debates about issues, where we would assign people to take different sides of an issue and to be able to debate something that maybe they don't even agree with. I did one episode where my entire job through the entire episode was to debate leftist ideas and principles in a way that I felt the left would think was legitimate. And then we proceeded to go and explain why those arguments didn't hold water, right? But in order for us to be able to do that, we have to be able to have that trust with one another, to be able to look at those issues, and to be able to truly explore them, and to do so in a way that the audience can look and be like, I've never thought of it that way, or that's an interesting perspective on that. So we appreciate the engagement. Again, go check out Circle, because that's the best. Circle is one of the best places that you can tell us what you would like us to discuss, the sort of debates you would like to have. And again, increasingly, we are going to get to more where it's not just going to be the three of us sitting around this table agreeing with one another. If we need to, we will enforce conflict at the table in order to get a viewpoint from multiple perspectives, and hopefully provide you an environment where you can also look at these various ideas and concepts, but you can do so with people that you feel like you can trust, that are being honest with you, and that will argue with a commitment to objective truth, objective morality, respect for logic and reason, empiricism. That's what we aim to do. We hope you have found this helpful. Once again, thank you very much, and we will see you next episode.